In this program, we shall, among many things, be seeking answers to the great and pressing question of evil. Before beginning, however, I must ask you to put away the science and psychology textbooks and all the Bibles, together with the conditioning you have received in your head from the accepted institutions of learning, in order to be free to explore with me some alternative perspectives and answers to this question and problem of evil. The evil and injustice which is in evidence everywhere and which plagues us personally and collectively derives, I believe, from an original sin very different from the one detailed in the Scriptures and traditionally accepted today. As I've shown to my audiences, it is only when we discover the facts about the origins of evil that good has a real chance of triumphing. The question of evil has been with our ancestors, and it will be our legacy to our descendants, our own children, if we do not come upon the answers now. This program will take us back through time to the official origins of the human race, and also further back to the more controversial mythological cycles of the pre-Diluvian ages, those before the flood. My research is based largely on the legends and myths of the Celtic race, my ancestors, who had much to say about the fall of man, the war between the forces of darkness and light, the abuse of sacred knowledge, and even on subjects like genetic manipulation. A close reading of the world's myths reveals that behind the veil of fairy folklore lies information concerning super technologies and advanced weaponry. In fact, throughout the world's seminal texts, be it the Bible, the Book of Enoch, the Popol Vuh, the Sanskrit Vedas, the Norse Edda, or the annals of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, we always find that those who were capable of fashioning and using such power weapons were also endowed with advanced mental and even psychic power. Indeed, these sagas and epics often make fact seem stranger than fiction, which is one of the reasons why they have not been taken seriously by most readers, or by those who labor under the weight of disinformation, indoctrinated into them by the disingenuous educational edifices concerning the level of proficiency and wisdom of our ancestors. And I suppose we don't need to be reminded that the subject of history, as it is taught to us in schools and textbooks, is certainly one of the most boring subjects there is. However, we should know that the study of how the subject of history has been manipulated is one of the most interesting subjects of all. Now, my work is not merely based, however, on idle speculations about the distant past, but is born from a passionate interest and involvement in what is transpiring in our own times, economically, politically, militaristically, and psychologically. From the very ancient texts that I will review come prophecies concerning our own age. Indeed, there is not a thing happening in today's complex world which has not been foreseen by the master seers and seeresses of old. In the early part of this millennium, I began work on this book, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation. In the opening preface of the book, I make the prediction that in a relatively short time from now, humankind is going to discover the facts about its actual origins, ancestry, and destiny. My own work is, I believe, a key part of this revelation. It is, however, revisionist in nature and rather controversial, since I believe and advocate that the truth concerning our history and beginnings would already be known to us had there not been an age-long overt suppression of such knowledge from religious, educational, and technocratic elites, operating in accordance to agendas which are severely detrimental to both humanity and the planet. Both the aristocratic and religious hierarchies and corporate regimes of today's world also have their origins in the primordial past. And there are important reasons why they have deemed it necessary to desecrate our planet, subordinate indigenous peoples, suppress women, massacre their enemies, sequester knowledge, and maintain a status quo in which the ordinary individual is economically and spiritually enslaved, reduced to being a pawn in a disposable and chronically disempowered underclass. In my book and in this presentation, I address who these oppressors are, how they operate and what their main agendas are, and what the next steps in their master plan are likely to be. We are presently in the early part of a new millennium, the 21st. The future rests on the past, and our futures will be determined in no small part by what we come to discover about our own origins. And though scientists are dedicated to finding their answers in the hypothetical future, perhaps we can find what is required in the dark pages of a hidden but very real and fascinating past. We are gradually discovering as this new millennium proceeds that the control of minds and the social behavior of the masses of mankind has been going on for a great deal longer than we might at first expect. Now, this point is, I think, beautifully brought out in a testimonial for my book Atlantis that I would like to read. For 50,000 years, the technocracy of power has indulged in suppression and slaughter in order to conceal the truth about humankind's origins and purpose. This indispensable work signals the failure of their age-old stratagems and deceptions, and is compulsory reading for those with a passionate desire to know the real origins of conflict on the planet and in the psyche. This generous testimonial from scholar and alternative historian Jordan Maxwell perfectly encapsulates, I think, the themes and the content of this book and also of this program, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation. Now, I began work on this book in the year 2000, but it encapsulates over 20 years of constant research into alternative history, comparative mythology, subversive movements, and into the origins of evil. Of the many things that I intended to accomplish in the writing of the book, and in the creation of this entire series, in fact, is one of the most important is to show that we have had on this planet no real campaign of empowered opposition against those forces who have seen fit to misinform, to impoverish, and even annihilate the human race. It's a sad fact that those whom we refer to loosely as the hidden masters have had no consistent opposition from us, until now, that is. I wish to let my readers know, and the viewers of this program know, that we are in the early stages of this new millennium, going to find ourselves in a time when we can, in fact, offer some actual and proactive opposition to those hidden forces who have long controlled our psychic and social lives. The present unrest in the world is part of this. It's part of the phase of the coming and healthy opposition. But the open economic extortion, the illegality and the saber-rattling of those forces within the government is all part of it. It's part of a symptom from those who know in government that their time of exposure and demise is close at hand. As I have already made clear, my interest is not just in the ancient past, but in the goings-on of our own time. I am very interested as to where we're heading as a species and whether we're going to have a future worth living. Fortunately or unfortunately, I haven't quite decided yet, my exposure to criminality and injustice and crime came when I grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, a war-torn and terror-ridden city, to say the least. Because of my utter contempt, though, of the injustices that I saw occurring in every corner of my country, I decided to separate myself from all of that abuse and criminality, and in fact to discover what might be described as the other Ireland. And of course, that's the Ireland of the Gaelic, the Celtic, and the Druidic traditions. This interest was to change the course of my intellectual life and spiritual destiny. My interest took me out into the field to study the remains of what is left of the ancient megalithic sites, and to go out on location and to see these marvels, many of which are impressive to say the least, many of which are in fact aligned to constellations and to the compass points and to other celestial events. It's not far-fetched to call Ireland a cathedral or even a temple without walls. Now, after discovering the level of advancement of the ancients, the Celtic forefathers, and of the English and other pre-Diluvian civilizations, I had to ask myself how it could be that we in the modern world can find ourselves so backward in so many areas. We may be technologically advanced, but we seem to be very primitive psychologically and emotionally, so much so, in fact, that we seem to relish warfare and bloodshed and crime and destruction. And we are so mind-controlled at this day and age with all of the religious and scientific fallacies and dogmas, not to mention all of the different political tyrannies that abound. and not to mention the moral leprosy that we find in so many people in this particular age, in this particular world. Naturally, like many of you, I soon realized that I would have to dispense with a great deal of what I've been told and taught from the books and the other official sources, because the very evidence of my own eyes was flying in the face of what I was being told from official channels. But all over the world, in hill and valley, on plain, something remarkable was before my eyes. Now, I soon realized that I was not the only one asking these kinds of questions, because other researchers had also long pondered how it is that all manner of human creations and customs and idioms and cultural anomalies should just appear fully formed without the prior antecedent stages. Now, we know that these stages must have existed because the arts of writing, mathematics, musical composition, astronomy, navigation, basket weaving, and pyramid building don't just come into being overnight. Even the arts of warfare and empire building and all that that entails must come from somewhere. But if a person has not gone out and spent some time studying the ancient megaliths or the great cities of the world, the ancient cities of the world, they may be excused for accepting the fallacy that everything that is advanced and culturally and technically chic does originate from the time of the Industrial Revolution or perhaps the Renaissance. But those who have spent quality time at such locations know that that just does not hold any weight. And that was certainly the case for me after studying the mythologies of Ireland and the rest of the world. Cultures, beliefs, and inventions with no apparent antecedents. That's right, folks. We have races and nations appearing out of nowhere, fully fledged, and then disappearing into the mystery, the mists of history. And then we have these experts of the modern day trying to deny and even trash the idea that we've had advanced civilizations in the pre-flood, pre-diluvian times. But that's not all. We've got men with domesticated horses. These are cave paintings, cave images in which we see human beings with domesticated horses many thousands of years before we're told that that came into being. We have the Lussac carvings. This is in France, in which we see men and women wearing hats, trousers, and skirts 15,000 years ago. And that's not a joke. That is actually images that have been discovered at Lussac in France. We have concrete that is 7,000 years old. We have the Japanese Jomon people making pottery over 16,000 years ago, and their pottery created by them, has been found as far away as Ecuador. We've got footprints in 60-million-year-old stone. People familiar with the works of Michael Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology. The alternative historians are now discovering this fact. In Zimbabwe, we've got an entire city there, the ruins of which have been discovered. They're 50,000 years old, and the stones that make the city walls are in perfect alignment. You couldn't even insert a blade in between them. There's absolutely nobody in the professional world who knows or who can account for the origin of these ruins in Zimbabwe and Africa. And I've said many times to audiences in all parts of the world that I've spoken in front of that the true occult history of Africa is something that still has to be told in our world. These images on the caves show men fighting dinosaurs. Now, how can that be? All over the world, we're told, in every school and college and in most textbooks, we're told that dinosaurs predate mankind by millions of years. And yet images have been found, no less, images have been found showing men in combat with dinosaur-like creatures. We have coral deposits brought up from the depths of the ocean, fathoms down, with striations on them. That's markings on them. These are understood to be markings that are on these coral deposits. They could only, repeat, only be made in an atmosphere of air, an air environment. Yet these are found fathoms deep. But the striations on them are made by wind and other elements that are found above the water level. We have this strange phenomena called notophilia. Notophilia just means sort of like the memory within animals and the strange behavior based on memory patterns, like eels. Eels are known to, when they cross the Atlantic Ocean, they don't just go straight across to the Sargasso Sea and then back across the Atlantic. They swim out, they maneuver, and then they mysteriously circle around nothing, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They suddenly make this big detour in a semicircular type of position, and then carry on. The same thing has been noticed with certain birds that fly overhead. They will circle in the sky in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean as if trying to land. But of course there's nothing there to land on, and then they proceed. The strange, almost humorous, comical behavior of the famous lemming, the little rodent that just hurls itself off the cliffs, in a sort of a suicide pact. And we're not really given descriptions as to why these manic creatures would do that. Well, it stands to reason that if in their racial memory, if in their genetic memory, these little creatures knew that there was land there in the north, up in Sweden and Norway and Siberia where these animals frequent, once upon a time in their memory, there was land there. So these are not some kamikaze animals that want to commit suicide. And more recently has come to light anomalies, very striking anomalies like the star-child skull and of course the crystal skull. And there's more than just one of those. Now this phenomena has, as I said, puzzled many a scholar, and Lawrence Gardner, he's a writer of books like The Genesis of the Grail Kings and so on, he perfectly summarizes the whole predicament. He says, it took man over 1 million years to progress from using stones as he found them to the realization that they could be chipped and flaked to better purpose. It then took another 500,000 years before Neanderthal man mastered the concept of stone tools, and a further 50,000 years before crops were cultivated and metallurgy was discovered. Hence, he says, by all scales of evolutionary reckoning, we should still be as far removed from any basic understanding of mathematics, engineering, or science. But here we are, only 7,000 years later, landing probes on Mars. So how did we inherit this wisdom, and from whom? It's a legitimate question, one that definitely needs to be answered. Who were they? Who were these individuals who created these megalithic sites and these marvels, these cyclopean ruins, what are often called the cyclopean ruins, the places of the giants? All over the world, especially in Celtic Ireland, you see these standing stones. Again, marvels of architecture, marvels of creations, and these are often aligned to compass points and to celestial events. And some are perfectly aligned even to this day. Another interesting thing that you see a lot in Celtic countries of the Sarmatians and the Vikings and even the northern Russia and all through the coast of England and Ireland are the great burial mounds where they say their fallen heroes, their fallen kings are meant to be interred. Again, the opening of these tombs often faced due north, and the stones around these burial chambers also were aligned to the constellations. Of course, they are not in pristine condition anymore. This is one of the great problems and predicaments of this kind of research, because down through the centuries, not only farmers, but all manner of people have come in and desecrated these barrows, these ancient tombs, by taking the stones out from inside and using them to build their walls during the later agricultural period. Now, some would not do that because they were frightened. They believed that these places were sacred and that the fairies and the spirits of the earth would seek retribution. But most of the places that you go, they have in fact been desecrated. And then you look around at the walls of these farms and you'll see gigantic stones that obviously were taken from these sacred sites. So the desecration is very pronounced. We've got the dolmens, we have the magnificent temple sites all over the world. And then we have this. Strange anomalies, strange figurines that, again, no satisfactory explanation. Are these earth spirits? Are these elves? We might compare these also to eyewitness accounts of extraterrestrials in modern times. I'm particularly fascinated by the crossbones motif. We find crossbone motifs in the cathedrals and churches and graveyards of Scotland and also of Ireland. But these little figurines, these little gnome-like creatures, the little people, as one might also want to call them, they're striking resemblance to the Greys. But this strange crossbone motif, we will be coming back to reanalyze that a little bit later on in the latter part of this program. One of the most fascinating of all sites in the entire world, and one that is considered to be the oldest megalithic site, that's older than even the pyramid by thousands of years, is situated in Ireland. The little red circle on the left of your screen shows you the County Meath, or County Meath, in Ireland, which is one of the 5 great provinces of ancient Ireland. The site known as New Grange, that's Brooke-na-Boyne in Gaelic, it's on the River Boyne, is a marvel of construction, and it's built out of quartz crystal using no cement. But the marvelous thing about it is that the sun, at the winter solstice, on the 3 days of the solstice, the sun will rise on the horizon and pass over this magnificent stone with the 3 spirals on it. This is the very famous stone that you may have seen. Well, the sun on the winter solstice passes across it, and then, as you can see on the picture on the left, it crosses the stone and enters into the little window that's about 7 feet high, and it penetrates into the inner part of the tomb, into the chamber, a beam of light lasting 17 seconds, and will fall on the rear of New Grange tumulus. That's the inside of the cairn. The light will fall for precisely 17 seconds on those 3 days. And on the evenings of those same 3 days, the moonlight will do the same thing. And folks, this happens today. And many of the American scholars and scientists like Arthur C. Clarke have gone out there and have taken their cameras and have visited this. I find this particularly moving and interesting because one of the great theosophists, that's George Russell of the Theosophical Society and the Occult Order of the Golden Dawn, who also was a poet, an Irish mystic, he declared that the phenomena of putting a camera or inserting a camera between the light as it comes in and the wall is actually responsible for the troubles in Ireland, and that this should not in fact happen, that the light should not be prevented on entering into the tomb on those sacred days. That's quite interesting theory. But again, England, Glastonbury Tor, the great mound which was central to all ancient peoples. All the kings of Ireland were interned in a mound representing the womb or the breasts of the mother goddess. And then you have the phallic tower on the top. And of course one might speculate that the famous Sermon on the Mount, you know, one emphasizes the sermon, but very few people think of the significance of the mount turning up in the Bible. It's quite a pagan symbolism there, that the sermon should have been on a mount. Then we can turn to Avebury in England, a fascinating site if ever there was one. One could do an entire 10-hour program on each of these particular anomalies. And of course the famous Stonehenge. The geometry alone of Stonehenge proves that these individuals were very, very sophisticated. So there is an actual archaeoastronomical or geomantic connection between the place that we know as Stonehenge and the Pyramid at Giza. There's a lot of work has been done on that. One of the most fascinating of all the anomalies, I think, in my opinion, in the world, and which pretty much got me started at the age of 13 into researching these things, was what was known as the Glastonbury Zodiac. The Glastonbury Zodiac was discovered by Lady Catherine Maltwood, and this is in fact a zodiac that can only be seen in its completion from the air. So just like the Nazca lines in Peru, so in England are these remarkable sites in which from the air you can see the 12 signs of the zodiac. This is the hedges, the lakes, and even some of the townships make the signs of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And then lo and behold, not very long after the Glastonbury zodiac was discovered, Mary Kane, a friend or associate of Lady Maltwood, discovered what was known as the Kingston zodiac just south of London. And in fact a third one had also been discovered. So the study of these was really fascinating, because there is not too many explanations of how these earthworks came into existence. But they were known as earlier as the Tudor dynasty. Sir John Dee had made some researches into these zodiacs. And then in the south of France, as came to light in the famous book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, came to light that in the south of France, in Languedoc area, there's a place called Rennes-le-Château, famous for its geometric alignments, where all the cities and the townships and the cathedrals and the churches are in perfect alignment with the constellations, and they make geometrical patterns. And some of the top cartographers in the world have confirmed this. Then we turn to the pyramid itself. And what do we find? One could write volumes, and one could do a show lasting 10 hours on the mystery of the pyramid alone. And we find, just in brief, that there is enough stone in the Giza pyramid to build 30 Empire State Buildings. There's enough stone in the pyramid to build a wall around the country of France, 3 meters high and 1 meter thick. The pyramid spans 13.5 acres and has 2.3 million blocks of stone. And nearby, there's a stone called the Baalbek stone, which is 1,000 tons. That's heavier than 3 jumbo jet planes. In China, if people think the pyramid in Egypt is monumental in its scale and its mystery, we have in China the Xi'an pyramid. And there are 15 smaller pyramids around the central one, which reaches up 1,000 feet. That's twice that of the Giza pyramid. 100 pyramids have been discovered in the Shenzhou province of China. The largest, according to one claim, is 1,200 feet high. That's 2.5 times the height of the Great Pyramid at Egypt. And it could, if hollow, swallow 26 Empire State Buildings. This is a man-made artifact in China. And then Angkor in Cambodia, one of the most fascinating sites, and recently has been studied by Graham Hancock. This entire precinct and temple and gardens is laid out, it has been discovered, to correspond as a terrestrial version of the constellation of Draco. Now, astronomers and astrologers know that Draco is probably one of the largest constellations in the night sky. This immense constellation making up, of course, innumerable stars. Well, it turns out that the little shrines and the little pagodas and the decorations and the entire layout of Angkor in Cambodia is based on the constellation of Draco. And England, one of the most ancient names of England, long before it was called the British Isles or United Kingdom or England, purists in the Celtic tradition or the Arthurian tradition would never refer to England by those names. The original ancient Arthurian name of England was called Logres. That's Logres, Logres. And it basically meant the land of the summer stars. Again, I think, it's a Druidic word, commemorating the fact that from England there was a Druidic or a priestly class who also were enamored by the mystery of the heavens and the stars. Graham Hancock has also proven and shown incredible underwater cities. In his book Underworld, there's some fine photographs and information on that. But in Egypt, we also have not just the anomalies in stone, we also have technological devices or hints at technological devices that were far ahead of its time. And let's not forget about the famous maps that predate what we have been told, maps that chart the world as it was in the days of old, like the Piri-Reis map, and others that are now coming to light. Longitudes were not even able to be accurately calculated until the 1770s, when John Harrison invented his chronometer number 4. However, the Piri-Reis map had the correct and accurate relative longitudes of the world. And of course, to make matters worse, when the little device was made by John Harrison, he died in scorn and nobody even bothered using his invention. He was completely laughed at. And let's not forget the phenomena of the crystal skull. This is a perfectly crystalline skull that has no join. And it's now come to light that there are more than just one of these fascinating artifacts. And of course, not only was there a high culture in Africa, not only was there a high culture in Ireland or in Egypt, but we know that in the Mexicos and South America, there was also an advanced civilization living there. And it has now recently been discovered at the turn of the millennium that the dates that are given for the Maya are incorrect, and that the Maya originated a lot earlier than has been thought before. And we know, because we can see the design of their temples, that they were also astronomers. In fact, the jaguar priests were even raised from childhood in the dark for almost 9 to 18 years in the dark, so that their eyes would be acclimatized to the night sky. And they make reference to something called the smoking mirror. And these smoking mirrors, once decoded, once that term is correctly decoded, we find out that that meant telescopes, meaning that telescopes were in the world hundreds of years, thousands of years before Galileo in the West is said to have discovered them. And what's more, we have coming out of the Aztec and the Maya kingdoms and their ancestors this most fascinating anomaly of all, which is the great so-called Aztec calendar, the Xolkin calendar, and the strange speculation of the end date, 2012. Those who have watched the my other production in the Origins and Oracle series will know that we go into that in great depth, the significance of that date and that calendar. In Egypt, we have a flower of life, a strange geometrical master cipher or symbol that's carved into the temple of Abydos in Egypt. The only trouble is, it's not carved, it's lasered into the walls. Scientists have discovered that this flower of life is actually lasered into the walls. And nobody has an explanation for that either. But all over the world, from Australia to the Himalayas, to the Ohio Serpent in America, to the Temple of Luxor, to Easter Island, we have anomalies and mysteries all over the world. In India, we also know that there was a great interest in constellations and the heavens because we have gigantic sundials that are almost as big as a whole town that have been discovered in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Jantar. One can hardly believe it. When you go there, we realize that these gigantic stone ruins were actually at one time great calendars. And then we have more famous anomalies that still befuddle us, like the Bermuda Triangle. And of course, every school child knows about the 7 great wonders of the ancient world. But what has to be understood is that these so-called 7 great wonders of the world were late in the day compared to what was going on many, many thousands of years before. Now, the major meta-theme of this particular program and of my work with Atlantis, alien visitation, and genetic manipulation is, of course, as I've mentioned before, the origin and nature of evil, what we have come to call evil. In order to focus in on this particular question now, I'd like to read the opening chapter, or the opening from the preface of my book, which says here that during the next 10 years, the human race is destined to finally discover the facts about its true origins and destiny. As part of this discovery, we have to address the overwhelmingly important question of how the phenomena of evil came into the world and into the consciousness of Earth's human inhabitants. This is a question that should be on the mind of every living man and woman. It has been with us for millennia, and it will be with the children of the future if we do not come upon the answer now. We have left the question of evil in the hands of theologians and scientists for too long. This was surely a mistake, for as the casualty statistics clearly testify, the institutions of religion and science have been the worst purveyors of evil that this planet has ever had to endure. After centuries of prevarication and criminality, we can no longer afford to look to these edifices to answer the all-important conundrum of evil. But if we turn from religion and science in this regard, does it mean that we are left in a void? Is there perhaps another answer to how the phenomena of evil came into being? I believe that the answer lies in the ancient records of our forefathers and in the myths and legends of the pre- and post-Diluvian epochs. Now, this question of how did the injustice and the criminality and the abuse that we see on every corner of this globe, how did it actually originate, has been addressed by several writers. Leonard Shlain, for instance, in his most recent book, Sex, Time, and Power, he has this to say: Eve's descendants have steadily accumulated the power to destroy each other in an unholy Armageddon and, like sleepwalkers, are shuffling towards a planetary ecological disaster. But how could a slight, 5-foot-tall, 2-legged animal create such sublimity and yet wreak so much havoc in so minuscule an interval of Earth's history? Erich Fromm, in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, writes about the real difference between the man and the beast. I mean, this is a question that has puzzled so many people, biologists, scientists, theologians, activists. What is the actual real difference, if there is one, between man and animal? Well, the real difference might in fact surprise you. Fromm says this: man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He, the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biologically non-adaptive and non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and the danger to man's existence as a species. And he goes on to say, the most ample and horrifying documentation for seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness are on the record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture, whose victims were men, women, and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction, in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors have any inhibitory effect. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out again and again. Leonard Shlain talks in his book on aggression. Homo sapiens, he says, possesses features that are located so far out at the extremes of the bell-shaped primate curve that they invite the curious to explore them. One of these is the capacity for aggression among humans, particularly the male of the species, and the pleasure most men so obviously derive from hunting and killing other animals. Our aggression has not only been outwardly directed at other species, interspecies mayhem, in the form of wars, duels, fights, persecutions, diabolical tortures, and genocide due to ethnic, racial, and religious hatred, has no parallel in the animal world. The sexual aggression exhibited by some human males towards females is without correspondence in the wild. The major rise in out-killing prowess occurred primarily in the last 100,000 years, with the sharpest spike limited to the last 40,000 years. Creation is a nightmare spectacular, taking place on a planet that has been soaked for hundreds of millions of years in the blood of its creatures. The soberest conclusion we can make is that the planet is being turned into a vast pit of fertilizer. And this is from San Francisco surgeon, one of the leading authors of our time. A perplexing problem, the whole problem of injustice and inhumanity, and the idea that it's just a natural movement of evolution, it's just nature's blunder, is simply not carrying weight anymore. How could that which is responsible for perfect order in the universe, from the greatest neutron star to the smallest atom, which is in perfect equilibrium, perfect harmony, make such a blunder in its highest creation, which is human beings? Man the destroyer, Homo vastans. On the one hand, man is akin to many species of animals in that he fights his own species. But on the other hand, he is among the thousands of species that fight the only one in which fighting is disruptive. Man is the only species that is a mass murderer, the only misfit in his own society. This is from Norman Tinbergen. Then from Erich Fromm, again, he says, man's aggressive behavior as manifested in war, crime, personal quarrels, and all kinds of destructive and sadistic behavior is due to the phylogenetically programmed innate instinct which seeks for discharge and waits for the proper occasion to be expressed. He goes on to say that only man seems to take pleasure in destroying life without any reason or purpose other than that of destroying. To put it more generally, only man appears to be destructive beyond the aim of defense or of attaining what he needs. And I might add, what is this strange phenomena that man requires religion? He has this barbaric, sadistic side, and then at the same time, he is the only creature that requires a religion. You don't see any other animal worshipping at altars or praying or even needing to conceive of that kind of thing. So where did this need arise is also one of the perplexing questions that is still with us. And of course, as I said in the preface of the book, when we normally have questions regarding the nature of evil, where is it normally that we turn? We turn to religion. We turn to the priests and the priestarchies. And they tell us, yes, this is our problem, this is our province, and we'll certainly explain it. But 2,000 years has gone by, and they've created more labyrinthine questions in trying to answer that one. And the scientists, well, they're not much concerned with the moral question, again, making things more difficult. And as I said in the preface, in one way you can think that the institutions of these organizations have been the worst purveyors of evil we've ever known. That goes almost without saying. And then when we actually look into the pages of the Bible, this so-called holy book, we find nothing but destruction and chaos and contradiction. Now we are told by the religions that man has two natures, good and evil. This is particularly brought out in the three major religions of the world, and specifically Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, that we have two natures, good and evil. One is then compelled to ask why God would instill such propensities in his own creations, who are meant to be made in his image. And if there's a point to that decision, what is it? we read that God created man and woman. This implies that God is not himself man or woman. Yet the religions all over the globe consistently and constantly depict and refer to God as male, even when, as in the case of Hebrew, the name for deity is of feminine gender. And why would God create something born in his image and then deny him some aspect of knowledge and then banish him from paradise once it has been received? Why does God condemn his creations for something that was not a conscious transgression? And we are told that man was not originally evil. You see, when we ask these questions of the clerics, then they come back and say, well, man was not originally evil. He became that way after the disobedience of Eve in the garden, or that they both became so after falling under the influence of the evil one, Satan. But then why would God allow his newly created beings to be in the proximity of such a being? One can also ask, who created the serpent, and why the tests on those who must already be innocent in nature? Were there not other more reliable angels to send? In the case of Job, why the test on someone that the omnipotent God must know is innocent? And again, why send Satan to do the testing, a being that himself cannot be trusted? Nowhere in the Genesis account, says Lawrence Gardner, is there any mention, direct or indirect, of Satan's involvement, and yet it has become common practice for the church to portray the serpent as an emissary of Satan, or even as Satan himself. Well, that's a heavy piece of information. One cannot also conceive, I write here, of the reason for the existence of any being like Satan that has no good in him at all. Surely God could only know evil if he had already brought evil into the world. What are we to think of the implication that evil was in the world even before man or woman were created? Well, if we're thinking creatures at all, we would have a lot to say about it. And if Satan could even have the ability to aspire towards supreme Godhead, and there are hierarchies of angels, etc., then perhaps God can indeed be rivaled and perhaps even surpassed. What are we to make of that? Now, in the book of Isaiah, God is quoted as saying, I create evil, while in Amos it is asked, shall there be evil in the city, and the Lord hath not done it? So we're hearing here that evil is actually created by God, who can actually himself act in evil ways if he so chooses. And what about the character of Jesus? We have contradictions and ambivalence there as well, because he turns over tables, he rebukes his mother, he talks about bringing a sword rather than peace. And in Luke he states, but those mine enemies, which would not that I reign over them, bring them hither and slay before me. Well, this is the Bible. This is the holy books. They're telling us, thou shalt not kill. But then we find that in Exodus 32, thus saith the Lord of Israel, put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And one only has to browse through the book of Deuteronomy to see that it is a testament of absolute annihilation and slaughter. The prohibition against killing, thou shalt not kill. We find that this was broken by the massacre of the Canaanites and others. The pronouncement and prohibition against stealing, thou shalt not steal. We find that this was broken when the Israelites robbed the cities of their enemies. And thou shalt not covet the property of a neighbor. That was broken when the land was confiscated. Now, if it is true, as the Bible declares and theologians state, that the sin involved Adam and Eve being made conscious of their nakedness, does this mean that God and the serpent and the others were clothed? We also find that God told a lie. Eve did eat off the tree, but did not, as was warned, die. So how and why would a God that put such currency in morality tell lies? I mean, it's just verbatim. If you can read it, there it is. Eve will die if she eats off the tree. Now we read that Cain, after slaying Abel, is banished forever by the Lord, but is then endowed with the mark to prevent anyone from slaying him. But why would the Lord want Cain's life spared? How would anyone know Cain's past deeds and want to kill him? And how could any mark matter one way or another? Is there a mark that denotes that one has committed fratricide? And furthermore, who would be in a position to kill Cain, since he and his parents were supposedly the only beings alive? Why does God create mankind and then, lamenting its supposed evil nature, proceed to destroy all his creations? And if indeed God wished to annihilate all that he had created, why do it so as to cause so much pain and fear, as we read in the Scriptures? We read that when Moses encounters Jehovah at the burning bush, God tells his prophet to be that he is the God of thy fathers. And this is very important. God tells Moses, I am the God of thy fathers. But how can this be? Moreover, why does Moses ask to know God's name if the chosen people would already know it? Among the many commandments that were levied by Jehovah was one categorically forbidding magical practices by any of the chosen. Why in this case were Moses and Aaron doing the rod and snake trick, so to speak, when in front of Pharaoh and his priests? Where do the exceptions begin and end? And why does Jehovah, who summoned Moses to secure the freedom of the chosen people, then, quote unquote, harden Pharaoh's heart to prevent their easy release? I mean, you're going to all this trouble to send your prophet in to release the chosen people, but the Scriptures then say that in this incredible game of chess, God himself hardens Pharaoh's heart to make it all that much more difficult. And why do we read of Jesus experiencing baptism from John? We take this as a given, but wait a minute. Why would the sinless Son of God need to go through a ritual reserved for the sinners seeking repentance and conversion? Why indeed? And Jesus himself wrote nothing, either of his own biography or his doctrine. Now, was such behavior consistent with someone who cared about the future or who was bent on founding a new global religion? I think not. Jesus also openly rebuked all public prayer. So why was this made a staple in later Christianity? Now, the American president, Thomas Jefferson, who had also studied these matters, has something very fascinating to say about the subject of Christianity. He says, and I quote, I have examined all the known superstitions of the world, and I do not find in our particular superstition of Christianity one redeeming feature. They are all alike founded on fables and mythology. Millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burned, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. What has been the effect of this coercion? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. He also says in another place, the clergy converted the simple teachings of Jesus into an engine for enslaving the world, and adulterated by artificial constructions into a contrivance to filch wealth and power to themselves. These clergy, in fact, constitute the real Antichrist. Now that is absolutely fascinating coming from such a famous historical personage. He's not only referring openly to Christianity as a superstition, but he's also saying right here that the whole Judeo-Christian paradigm is a contrivance. He's also making it clear that one can be against the institution of religion, of Christianity, but obviously glean something important from the teachings of Christ. Here we have the works of a man, an individual, a highly enlightened being. That's a totally different understanding than the bastions and the institutions and the dogmas. If only we had Jefferson's wisdom today. President John Adams, one of the early American presidents, he says the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus is made a convenient cover for absurdity. Strong language there. And he also says in another place, the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Not in any sense. Now, Erich Fromm, in his book Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, says this: the deep need of man not to feel lost and lonely in the world had, of course, been previously satisfied by the concept of a God who had created this world and was concerned with each and every creature. But for many of those for whom God was dethroned, the need for a godlike figure did not disappear. Some proclaimed a new God, evolution, and worshipped Darwin as his prophet. So again, we human beings seem to be creatures of this ambivalence. When we give up one bromide, we move to another, equally unsustainable, which in history then becomes eventually refuted. If it's not religion, it's science. But as I said in the preface, if we turn aside from these two bastions, are we left in a void? Is there no other place to look for the answers to the world's conundrums and mysteries? Well, I think there is, and my work very much proves this, that the answers are in the myths and legends of our own ancestors, those individuals who did things right the first time round. And of all the ancient pre-Diluvian cultures, the mysteries of Atlantis, of course, take central focus. But Atlantis, what do we really know? Well, H.G. Wells puts it this way: there is magic in names, he says, and the mightiest among these words of magic is Atlantis. It is as if this vision of a lost culture touched the most hidden thoughts of our soul. And Plato, who wrote extensively on Atlantis, he says, "On this island of Atlantis had arisen a powerful and remarkable dynasty of kings who ruled Europe as far as western Italy." Marcellus, the Roman thinker, he says Atlantis, which was extremely large for a long time, held sway over all the islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Socrates declared, "It has the very great advantage of being a fact and not a fiction." Now here we are, the greatest philosopher in the world. Copplestone and some of the commentators on philosophy said that all later philosophy are but footnotes to Plato. And of course, Plato was the writer, the spokesman, and the biographer of Socrates. So here we have literally the greatest philosopher of all time, confirming for us that Atlantis, in his own words, is not fiction, but in fact. And my mentor from England, J.R.R. Tolkien, he says of Atlantis, of all the mythical or archetypal images, this is the one most deeply seated in my imagination. This is the creator of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth. And he's saying that of all the archetypal images that one could think of, this is the one that he finds the most gripping on his imagination. And the names of Atlantis are many, of course. We have all different cultures referring to Atlantis and the Garden of Paradise, or the Elysian Fields and so on. The Celtic people knew it as Hyperborea, which simply means extreme north. The Germanic Teutons, the Teutonic people, called it Tula, or ultimate Thule. And the Garden of Hesperides. In fact, we get our word Brazil from an old Celtic word, Hy Brasil, which referred to, again, the land of everlasting youth. And all nations of the earth, all cultures, be they the Native American Indians or the Greeks or the Chinese or the Babylonians, all talked about their forefathers coming from highly advanced cultures in ancient times. But we also read of this kind of thing in the book of Genesis. We also read about in the book of Isaiah and Ezekiel, and then the Ramayana of India, stories about ancient gods and weaponry, advanced weaponry, and the war between the forces of good and evil. And as I said, the myths, once one gets into them, that is one of the most interesting archives of knowledge that we could possibly turn to reveal some of the secrets that science still has not uncovered or is very slow to uncover. So let's take a brief look at what the myths actually have to say. Starting with the Celtic legends. In Irish mythology, at the dawn of the historical era, we have this incredible and famous tale of St. Patrick, who is meant to have gone up to the Holy Mountain. This is a mountain on the west coast in County Galway called Croagh Patrick. And this is the famous mountain of Patrick that he is meant to have ascended and meditated on the top of the mountain. And then when he came down, he is meant to have pronounced to those gathered there, if you believe these stories, of course, that he has cast all the serpents from the land. That's what he said. I have cast all the serpents from the land. Of course, the local Irish are thinking, well, wait a minute, what's he talking about? We've never had any snakes here to begin with. Well, it becomes very difficult to understand this story, this particular statement, until you understand what it means. It was nothing more than political propaganda, theological propaganda for something, because the serpents were not, in fact, relating to physical snakes at all. They were referring to a race of people, a race of beings. In Ireland, there were many visitations to the land of Ireland before the Christian era. There was in fact 5 waves of invasions by different groups. And one of these groups is known in Gaelic as the Tatha Di Danan, or the Tuatha Di Danan if you want the pronunciation in English. It looks as it sounds there. And I'll spare you the Gaelic. If you're interested in these Gaelic pronunciations, you can get a good book on it. There's lots of good books. This particular one here by Steve Blamies, which is Glamorai, is an excellent book which will help you with the various pronunciations of these terms. But the Tuatha Di Danan, or the Tuatha Di Danan, simply means, when translated, the tribe of the goddess Danu. The tribe of the goddess Danu, implying that they were a matriarchal group. This was the 5th wave of invasions of powerful magicians, Druidic class, who were a matriarchy, who visited Ireland after what they claim was the destruction of their own kingdoms and their own lands. And it has always been a point of contention why it is that Ireland was colonized from the west. Where, of course, one only has to look at a map to know that there's nothing out there. You would expect colonization from the east, or maybe even from the south. But it's recognized by the scholars of Trinity University and elsewhere that Ireland was colonized from the west. And yet out there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there is no land. Well, there's no land there now. And as I said, the leaders of the Didanan were very emphatic about the fact that they had come from lands in the west, beautiful, paradisical, technically advanced lands, but these had been destroyed in a great cataclysm. And these 4 lands, these 4 great islands, were known in Gaelic as Fallius, Murius, Gorius, and Phineas. And in Celtic mythology, if you really get into it, you'll find that there's a whole slew of other famous lands and islands. The land of promise, the land of happiness, the land of living, and of course the famous Tir na Nog, the land of the everlasting youth. Now the High King of this particular order of Druids, this particular race that visited Ireland in prehistoric times, is known by the name of Nada, or if you want to anglicize it, Nuada. But that word can also be written Nua, and often is written that way, which is very close, I think, to the word Noah. Well, so is the mythology relating to the Tuatha Di Danan and to Nada, because Nada and his tribe of the goddess Danu not only come from the west, but they arrive on ships. They arrive on ships that they say that they were told to build in order to survive the great deluge that was coming. And they arrive safely to the haven, which was Ireland. So many thousands of miles apart, and we have a very similar type of story going on. And very much at the heart of the legends of the Didanan is mention of the weapons of magical power, because there is great mention of the psychic power that these ancients had, but they also refer to magical weaponry, the famous harp and the sword and the lance. In fact, the Celtic mythology speaks of the 4 gods of the Tuatha Di Danan, each possessing or owning a weapon or a magical talisman. There was Nada's sword, Retaliator. There was Lu, the sun god. He had a lance, a famous lance. There was the great cauldron or cup of the Dagda. Dagda was like a sort of a Hercules type god. And then there was the stone, or the stone plate of Manannán Mac Lir, very similar to the Bethel stone, or the stone of Jeremiah. The stone of Manannán Mac Lir. And the Isle of Man, which exists between Ireland and England, is named after Manannán Mac Lir. But any students of the tarot cards will notice something strange in this, because in fact these 4 weapons or 4 objects are in fact nothing less than the 4 suits of the tarot: the famous wand, the cup, the sword, and the plate or the disc. So we have a lot of questions there. Was the tarot known to the ancient Celts as well as to the Egyptians and the Semites? And not a sword would vibrate or shimmer in the presence of evil. It is actually a prototype to the later Excalibur. And in fact, for those who are interested in Arthurian legends, most of the Arthurian legends were in fact based on the earlier legends of Celtic Ireland. This particular epoch that I'm talking about and referring to, of the tribe of Tuatha Dé Danann and their subsequent story and mythologies and wars and fights on the land of Ireland, became the prototype for the later Arthurian legends, and many of the dramatis personae are in fact the same if you actually get into it. And in one of the most incredible stories relating to the exploits of the gods, the sun god Lu, as a young man, has to come out and do battle with a great giant, a very evil being who's connected to a race called the Fomorian race, who had occupied Ireland many thousands of years before the coming of the Dé Danann. And the young Lu is said to have come out and he defeats Baelor of the Evil Eye, this great giant, with a sling. Now wait a minute, where have we heard this story before of the young hero, the young man, the sun god, the radiant one, who comes out and saves his people against a great evil giant using a slingshot as a weapon? It's so old, it's new. Now, Baelor of the Evil Eye was a member of the earliest Aboriginal inhabitants of Ireland, a very mysterious people called the Fomorian race. The Fomorian race. The most prehistoric race of Ireland, the Aboriginal inhabitants, the Fomori. It actually is a word that means the giants, and it's also derived from a term meaning those from under the sea. One of the ancient Celtic names of the Lost Isles was Tir Fo Thuan, which means land under the wave, or land beneath the wave. Now, the king of the Fomorians for part of the time was Conan, King Conan's people. And Robert Howard, the mythologist and historian, writes of Conan, "In Conan's veins flowed the blood of ancient Atlantis." An interesting statement. But when it comes to mysterious races of the past, we only have to look at the Bible itself. Because in Genesis chapter 6 we read, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. So we've got men, and we've got the daughters of men, implying women. And then we got somebody else loose on the world. And in fact, this Tuatha Dé Danann, who went by the name of the serpent priests, in Egypt they had a serpent race, a serpent culture. But their name was the Jedi, or the Jedi. Now, where we heard that term before? And the Egyptians noted them as a race of magical druids with special powers, the Jedi. In fact, the word serpent in the Americas was known as Amaraka. Amaraka, or America, actually means land of the serpent. It's one of the oldest words for the serpent. And of all the symbols and sigils of the serpent race, of course there were many, like the serpent itself. One of the most important was what we now recognize as the letter K. And this is very well brought out when you look at the names of the Native American tribes of North America, because they were very involved in the serpent symbolism. They loved the symbol of the serpent. A lot of their dances were based on the serpent. In South America you have the idea of the plumed serpent. But the letter K also stands out to emphasize this. The term Oklahoma, Muskogee, Choctaw, Nakota, Dakota, Cherokee, Mohawk, Yaqui, Comanche, all of these terms, like Seneca and America or Yankee, these terms have the strong K without fail. And that is because the letter K originally was a sigil or a sign referring to the serpent. Back to Celtic mythology, one of the later important personages was known as Finn MacCool, or Finn MacCoomhill. He was the hero of the Fenian cycle and last of the giants. He was indirectly related to the Tuatha Dé Danann by way of his godfather Lu, the sun god. But he was one of the last great heroes. And his name actually means white foreigner or white Gael. He was the father of Oisin, the son of Cuchulainn. Now the word Fenian derives from Phoenician. Okay, so Finn McCool and his group was known as the Fenian cycle in Irish mythology. This is a mythological cycle that's recognized. And he gave rise to the Fenians. But the word Fenian is very interesting because it actually derives from the word Phoenician, the great maritime race that originated from Britain and not from the Middle East, as we have been told. And the Phoenicians later became what we know as the Venetians. Now we'll be coming back to this at a later part of this program, because a very interesting connection there that has not previously been brought out. Finn McCool's father was called Cuchulainn, and Cuchulainn is, as any Irish person knows, one of the greatest heroes in our culture. Cuchulainn, the great giant and hero. But all I can say about that is, before we get into the legends of Cuchulainn, one only has to look at the name. There's something interesting there. The word Cuchulainn of Ireland is remarkably similar to Kukulkan, the great hero of Mexico. Kukulkan, of course, was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The pronunciation, the syllables, it's very similar there. Cuchulainn of Ireland, Kukulkan of Mexico. And if you get into the symbolism of these two deities and what they got up to, again, there are many correspondences. Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, was the feathered serpent. So thousands of miles away, we have the same symbolism. We have the serpent symbolism and the raven symbolism in the totem poles all over Americas, from Alaska right down to South America. We have the great sand paintings, which always include the symbol of the serpent. Talking about dispersion, it is a fact that the Norse Edda, the holy books of the Norsemen, the holy books of the Teutons, written by the Skalds, is a book known collectively as the Norse Edda. Well, the sacred books of the Far East, of the Indus Valley, and the ancient Sanskrit works are called the Veda. Now, when you take the V off Veda, you have the term Edda. Both means holy books. Edda, Veda, it's the same thing, holy books. And what's more, if you think I'm stretching this point, you will find that the dramatis personae of both books are uncannily similar. The king lists and the goings-on, the exploits, are remarkably similar. This can be proven and has been written about. In the Bible again, while in the wilderness, we find that Moses was said to have carried a standard known as the brazen serpent. Since the Old Testament strictly forbids graven images of God, we can surmise that the brazen serpent was a very important symbol of power, which was not forbidden. But there again, just for now, let's note that they were talking about a serpent, a brazen serpent standard of the Israelites. When Moses destroyed the Amalekites, he erected a pillar to a god, his god, and that God's term in the Bible is Jehovah Nissi, which when translated means God of the serpents. Now wait a minute, how come we weren't told this in Sunday school? God of the serpents? What's that? What God? In the Bible, the Nashon. This is the Judaic tribe of which King David was a member, the Nashon. But this word also, translated, means the serpent. And it's in fact where we get the word nation. The modern word nation comes from the Semitic or Hebrew Nashon. So when we hear people talking about the nation states, the great nation states, just remember that it means the serpent. Over 2,000 years BC, the Sumerian name for the Giza pyramid was the House of the Serpent. And if one really does their mythological homework, it will be discovered that what we call Egypt was not known as Egypt in those days. The actual name of Egypt was Kem. But anyone who lived outside the region of the country of Egypt used to habitually refer to Egypt as the land of the tree and the serpent. The land of the tree and the serpent was how everyone from the neighboring states, neighboring countries referred to the land of Egypt. We have in Egypt the famous symbol of the uraeus, that's the winged disc. And with the wings and with the disc always comes the symbols of the uraeus serpent. We have the famous symbol of Buto, the god of the northern part of Egypt, wearing the crown, and that is always shown again as a winged serpent. They had a fascination with this image. Even the pharaoh upon his head would wear the uraeus serpent. Did that represent enlightenment? Or did it also represent that, like the Tuatha De Danann, they were calling themselves the race of the serpent? That this was a serpent race? Miss Harrison, the historian, quoting from Joseph Campbell's Occidental Mythology, she says, Zeus, that's the Greek god Zeus, is one of the very few Greek gods who never appears attended by a snake. Well, actually, there are symbols of Zeus with the serpent, but she's saying that he's one of the few Greek gods who never appears attended by a snake, implying that most of the other gods are. Now, Madame Blavatsky, in her fine book Isis Unveiled, speaks of Pythagoras, the famous pre-Grecian philosopher Pythagoras. She says, Pythagoras never allowed his neophytes to see him during the years of probation, but he instructed them from behind a curtain in his cave. Now one might ask, why would he do that? Well, the word Pythagoras actually means, I am the python. I am the python? What does that mean? In Celtic Ireland again, or in the Arthurian tradition, we have this mysterious word Pendragon. It's actually said to be the surname of Arthur. Arthur's father was Uther, Uther Pendragon. The word means the head of the dragons. That's right. Pen is head, and dragon, same as it is today, the dragon, the head of the dragons. What dragons? We have the Scottish Regiment, the Dragoons. In 15th century England, we have the Plantagenet, the Dragon Court. Those mysterious megalithic sites we were looking at earlier, especially the ones in Carnac and in Brittany and also in Cornwall, the locals refer to these standing stones as the dragon's teeth. And why would they be associating serpents and dragons with these ancient sites? And of course, even some of the flags of the British Isles still commemorate the dragon, like the Welsh flag and the Scottish flag, but particularly the Welsh, where they have the five-toed red dragon. Now, in the turn of the century, Alfred Watkins discovered what is known as ley lines. These are mysterious earth energy grid lines that are in the earth, but he also referred to them as the dragon paths. These were also known as the dragon paths. And Watkins and other people who had studied these ley lines understood that these were used by ancient peoples when they were designing and aligning their cities, and when they were designing and setting the sites for these ancient mounds and these ancient burial sites. The ley lines were very much in use and can still, of course, be seen today. And closer to home, America, we have the Ohio serpent, a very famous earthwork that is being studied at this time. They don't know if it's coming from the Native American Indians or something more aboriginal, but here is this vast mound that from the air looks like a serpent. And in Avebury, we have one that's about 8 miles long, called the Avebury serpent. And of course, the ley lines, it's now been discovered that these ley lines and these serpentine force grid lines in the earth, this is where, if you follow them, if you track them, you'll also find that some churches and cathedrals and even famous buildings have been put directly on the vertices between these ley lines, even in modern times. But all over the world, from China to Japan to England and Ireland, you have the symbols of the griffins and the dragons and the gargoyles. It's almost so common that we don't even notice it. Now it's interesting because the dragon, from one point of view, has some very spiritual meanings and symbols attached to it. It has been noted that the dragon actually encompasses the 4 elements and is in fact a representation of the 5th mysterious element. They know this because they say that the dragon's claws, which dig into the earth, represent the element of earth. And they say that the scales, the fishy-like scales on its body, represent the element water. And of course, the wings that beat the air of the dragon represent the element air, and the fire that it breathes is meant to represent fire. So the dragon is a composite of the 4 states of consciousness and of the 4 elements, and the dragon being the 5th element. But all over the world, and especially in Celtic drawings, even of the Christian era, we see a great emphasis on the twin dragons and the serpent. Here are 3 coiled dragons, which are known as the Ouroboros. But interestingly, these come from 3 different places. This is from China, Mexico, and Egypt. The exact same symbol of the coiled dragon eating its own tail, from 3 different cultures. In Scandinavian mythology, in the famous Norse Edda, they have an entity called the Midgard serpent. And it turns out that in Christianity, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we hear about the cherubim and the seraphim. But if you actually translate these words, you will find that both words mean flaming or burning serpent. And it's interesting too that the adversarial force is often seen as some sort of a hybrid devil or a loathsome creature, but in many renditions and many images coming out of the Christian world, the adversarial force, the satanic force, is actually shown as a human being and not as some monstrous creature. We'll be coming back to that point later on. It's very interesting as to why the adversarial energy would also be shown in human shape. In fact, it's interesting why even the angels are shown in human shape. And of course, the most famous rendition of the serpent image is in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, at the Garden of Eden, and the scene of Adam and Eve at the tree, and Eve's discussion with the serpent, which is meant to have led to the temptation and the fall of man. But what Christians will fail to tell you, or probably don't know, is that originally the symbol of the cross was always attended with a serpent. Just as you see in this picture, this was the original Christian symbol. The cross was never seen in any culture, and even in the earliest days of Christianity, it was always attended with a serpent. And this is again brought out in the words of Christ himself when he, remonstrating with his 12 disciples, he actually said, be as gentle as doves, but as wise as serpents. What serpents? Why would the Son of God be remonstrating with his disciples and telling them to be as wise as serpents? Of course, we have footnotes in the Bible for everything else, but there's no footnote explaining to what serpents he's referring. In Celtic mythology, we find out that the famous location of the kings, this is the capital of Ireland, where the three kings of Ireland would sit on the east coast of Ireland, in County Meath, is well known as Tara. But in Gaelic, Tara is known as Drumcain. But Drumcain, translated into English, means the hill of the serpents. Again, this identification with royalty, Irish royalty, Celtic royalty, and the serpent image. The Pendragons of Arthurian England, the serpents of Ireland. Now, in ancient times, the serpent was known by the word Cain. In fact, the word land of Canaan actually also means the land of the serpents. But the word Cohen, this is a word that is given to many Jewish people. But go and ask any rabbi, ask anybody who has that term what it actually means, and they will tell you. The word Cohen means serpent priest. And that's where we get the word Cain from, and we get the word Khan from, like James Khan. The American television channel CNN, not only is that the word without the vowels for the word serpent, but even the logo is very serpentine shaped. In Far East we have Chan. Chan is like we would say sir to a man over here. Well, Chan in China means the serpent. In the Middle East, we have the title that is given to men over there, Khan, Khan. It's exactly the same meaning. We have the word Kieran. It's a name of a man in Ireland, Kieran, or the English word name of women, Karen. And the word for death, Karn. All of these terms and many more actually have derivation. Their derivation goes back to the word for serpent. So we come full circle. When we hear St. Patrick descending from the holy mountain, this is the paragon of Christianity, descending from the holy mountain and telling the people gathered there, behold, I have cast the serpents from the land. He is not talking about physical snakes. This is political, or it is religious, theocratic, theological propaganda. He's saying, Christianity has arrived, I am in town, there's a new gig, there's a new game in town, and you can just forget about these serpents and the previous races that were here. Their time is over, and the new sun religion, the new solar paradigm has arrived. That's what it represents. And it implies, of course, that the people of the prehistoric times, before Christianity, not only revered the symbol of the serpent, but were actually known as the serpents. And we'll come to more explanation of why that is a little bit later. Now, even though there's a great wealth coming out of the ancient mythologies of all countries, scientists disagree and speculate that there was no ancient civilizations of any merit in ancient times. But the ancient legends also speak about their own demise, just like the Tuatha De Danann, saying that they came from islands that were destroyed in a great war of the gods and a great calamity of nature. So we have in many of the mythologies of the world this reference to destruction and cataclysm and upheaval. The most famous story, of course, is Noah, the famous patriarch, being literally told by God of a coming flood, and that the whole earth was going to be in tribulation, and that he should build a vessel so that the chosen ones could be saved. But that's not the only area in the scriptures where we read of cataclysm. Yes, there's the deluge, but then we also have the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt. We have the story of the destruction in Sodom and Gomorrah. And we have the story of the walls of Jericho being blasted to pieces. And in many other areas through the whole book of Job, there's tumult and cataclysm and stories of great upheaval. In Genesis 6, God is saying, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Now, from a scientific point of view, what are we told? We're told, yes, we have an ice age. This ice age happened in what we know as the Pleistocene epoch, and before the ice age, there was nothing. Men walked around in skins, and Neanderthal man, hunter-gatherers. No such concept as Atlantis or Lemuria or any other advanced civilization could possibly existed. So what is the tenets of the official theory? Well, the high priests of geology were of Charles Lyell. He was the exponent of the theory of uniformity. That simply means that through the geological record, nature, evolution, all of these things are incrementally slow. Very, very slow movements of development over vast expanses of time. Louis Agassiz, he was the exponent of the glacial theory, exponent of the ice ages. And particularly Professor James Geekie, geology professor, Edinburgh University, a major champion of the Ice Age theory. And believe me, that's all it is, a theory, as we're about to see. Now, the Ice Ages are meant to have taken place, geologically speaking, in what is known as the Pleistocene epoch. This is the epoch lasting 2 million years that is housing what we know as the Ice Age. But Professor James Geekie says, if there is anything more fantastic than Geekie's extravagant theory, it is that it has been lapped up by his successors and by intelligent men who, by logic alone, should be able to denounce it. Yet it is today a dogma. This is Commons Beaumont, one of the most suppressed scholars of all time, talking about Geekie's findings. He says it's unsustainable, simply a dogma. Communist Beaumont goes on to say, the flood, to the world generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation, and its ravages in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands may be retraced to more considerable extent by the effects of what geologists term the drift age. It was no mere ice drift, it was a sudden and terribly swift and violent. So Beaumont was one of the great catastrophists. Along with Immanuel Velikovsky, he was a person who decried and did not believe in or subscribe to the uniformitarian philosophy. He understood that we had been visited by tremendously swift cataclysms of the past. And he spent his life trying to refute what Geekie and the uniformitarianists were advancing. And in the fine book, When the Earth Nearly Died, by Allen and Dallaire, they say, it is an astonishing that such an unscientific explanation ever came to be formulated, yet in a short time both it and the concept of immense, thick ice sheets descending from a hypothetical northern mountain system was enthusiastically embraced as virtually established fact. They go on to write, the evidence is perfectly unambiguous, along with the removal of an ice age like that which is hitherto commonly envisaged. The evidence suggests that there is something seriously amiss with the last phases of standard geological chronology. Now, these unsustainable theories of ice ages and drift ages has been refuted in the 90s by several authors, not only Allen and Dallaire, but by Michael Cremo in his monumental work Forbidden Archaeology, and more specifically by the Observer magazine scientific writer Robert Milton, who wrote a fine book called Shattering the Myths of Darwin. Now, Clifford Wilson, in his book, The Chariots Still Crash, he says, some dates obtained by other radiometric methods are seriously astray, such as the age of millions of years being attributed to volcanic rocks in Hawaii, which are known to be less than 200 years old. This is reported in the Journal of Geophysical Research. It is known that these lava rocks were actually formed in 1800 and 1801 in Hualai in Hawaii. The potassium-argon dating methods was utilized, and a formation age of 160 million to 3 billion years were given for this rock formation, which was known to be just over 170 years old. This is not an isolated report. Rock samples from 12 volcanoes in Russia and 10 samples from other places around the world, all known to be of recent age, that is, formed within the last 200 years, when dated by the uranium-thorium-lead method, gave ages varying from millions to billions of years. So here's your science for you. But luckily, a lot of these scientific findings are now being seriously refuted, and we need to know about this. Clifford Wilson goes on to say, there is increasing evidence to suggest that those figures of millions of years, which we were given in our childhood, must be put to one side. And indeed they must. But what would happen if they are? What happens if we suddenly start to question these Royal Academy and Royal Society dates and figures and scholarship? Well, then the truth of what might be behind that Pleistocene epoch, I mean, if you concertine the whole 2 million year Pleistocene epoch out of existence, suddenly you have no ice ages, no substantial ice ages, and therefore no great wall between our time and the past. Evidence thus converges from numerous directions to support the conclusion that on the testimony of radiocarbon and other dating techniques, immense physical and climatic changes occurred on Earth some 11,000 years or so ago, when an ice age that probably never existed came to an end, and an apparently uniformitarian regime was abruptly terminated. There you are. That's Allen and Dallaire saying that something happened so much more recently, and it had very little to do with an ice age. Thus, if many of today's highest mountains were much lower when the alleged ice age was reputedly at its zenith, then how did so much ice, if it actually existed, manage to accumulate? Indeed, we can take a step further and ask whether the ice sheets so beloved of the glacialists ever existed at all. Now, these two geologists have discovered that the mountains that are quite high today all over the world were not as high 11,000 years ago. Well, of course, that goes to the heart of the glacialists' theory. You have to have very high peaks in order to have the cold for the ice sheets to be created. But if those mountain peaks were much lower than they actually were being told, then there goes your ice theory right out the window. They go on to say, the time allegedly occupied by the glacial and interglacial episodes of conventional Pleistocene chronology was actually non-existent. Now, how come we have not heard worldwide debate about this book or of Robert Milton's Shattering the Myths of Darwinism? How come we are not hearing debate on the television and in the magazines about these fine books? In Colin Renfrew's book, Before Civilization, he says, archaeologists all over the world have realized that much of prehistory, as written in the existing textbooks, is inadequate, some of it quite simply wrong. And I have a question. If this is the case, then how can science go that wrong? We have experts like Agizes and Lyle, we have Darwin, we have these uniformitarian theories that are just wholesale sold to us, over the counter, so to speak. We have millions of dollars being thrown into all of these researches, and yet we come up now to discover that the whole Pleistocene epoch is unsustainable. I have a question. How can science go that wrong? Now, the refutations to Darwinism and the refutations to the uniformitarianists would take too long to go in here. I just want to give an overview of this fascinating dichotomy and the new research that is showing that a lot of these philosophies are simply unsustainable and unrealistic. And we have to take that on board before we can proceed. But what I want to look at now is another anomaly. All over the world we're hearing about strange vehicles and visitations from other planets. Dr. Harrison H. Brown of the California Institute of Technology has this to say about our universe. He says, he estimates that virtually every star in our galaxy has a planetary system, in each of which, from 2 or 4 planets, might have an Earth-like environment and chemistry that encourages our kind of life to exist. He gives the enormous figure of 100 billion stars with planets in the Milky Way galaxy alone. And guess what, folks? There are 450 billion galaxies. And that's just the ones they know about, or the ones that they can see. So it's preposterous, is it not? I mean, we can lay it aside once and for all. That when somebody says, on Earth is the only kind of life that could possibly exist of our type in the universe, simply, that could not be true. And the Bible seems to agree, because here is a passage from the book of Ezekiel. In fact, this is a very famous passage, well known to people in the UFO and paranormal community, but for those who have never seen it, let's read it. Now, as I looked upon the living creatures, says Ezekiel, he has a vision, and he says, now as I looked upon the living creatures, I saw 4 wings upon the ground, one by each of the living creatures with their 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their composition was like the color of shiny amber, and all 4 wings had but one likeness, and their composition was like a wheel in the middle of a wheel. You can draw your own conclusions, but this sounds very much like he's actually seeing some kind of mechanical apparatus. But of course, not being able to understand it, he describes it in the idioms of his own time. Wheels within wheels. In Assyria, in Babylon, we have, just like in Egypt, the winged disc. Here you can see, again from Sumeria, Babylon, strange artifacts. On the picture on the left, you can see that above the heads of the people who are standing on the ground is a strange winged satellite, a strange winged object satelliting above in the air. And on the right, you can see the constellations and the symbols of the serpent and other celestial orbs. There's a closer image that in head height, floating in the air, we have some strange object. And the 2 fishes, that could represent one of the constellations. And we have lunar symbols and crescents and pictures of the planets, symbols of the planets. And then amid them, we have a shiny disk with wings, a projectile of some kind. We can look again at the Egyptian idea of the winged globe. In Christian art, it has come to light that in many medieval paintings we have symbols of UFOs. Here Giotto is showing the angels with wings and with halos circulating above. And in this one by Giotto also, from the same picture, we have a small projectile with a person sitting inside this capsule with a joystick. Here is a picture of the Madonna, and to her right shoulder, we see a man looking up into the sky, literally looking up into the sky with a strange metallic projectile, an egg-like projectile floating in the sky above this picture of the Madonna and the Holy Family. Coming out of the ancient world, we have artifacts that bear uncanny resemblance to projectiles and missiles and to shuttles and equipment that is used today. Here from the Temple of Abydos, literally bas-reliefs in the carvings in the walls show helicopters, submarines, submersibles. The picture on the left is from Abydos. It looks like a helicopter, again very much in the same shape as the Apache helicopter of today. Here from the Sumerian and Babylonian, we have a silo. On the left, there's a picture of what looks like a projectile, a silo, a rocket, under the earth with individuals inside seem to be manipulating controls, and the top of the projectile is amongst the trees, and you can see little human figures venerating and bowing. And in the Scandinavian and Celtic mythologies, there's reference to the dragon ships. And of course, the artist on the right has done something quite interesting. He's put his ship up in the sky. Is he trying to tell us something there? Now, in Far East, we have the mention of Vimana. In the Hindu tradition, the Vimana was a rocket ship or a flying UFO, clearly described in the ancient legends of India. They're also called the Shem, S-H-E-M. We have Elijah's vision, as we just saw. We have the myth of Etana. This is King Etana. This is a 4,700-year-old myth, but it supplies us with very accurate descriptions of the Earth's surface from progressive altitudes, descriptions which are not verified in our own era until high-altitude aerial flights of 1950s and the first space shots of the 1960s. King Etana, in an ancient Babylonian book, is talking about him being lifted off the Earth in a UFO-type craft and flying up and seeing the Earth receding behind him. We have the similar discussion in Enoch, another one of the patriarchs of the Bible, how he's taken up by God to walk amongst the heavens, and he again also explains that he sees the Earth receding behind him. In the book of Ezekiel, we have a fascinating passage. Then Eve looked up to heaven and saw a shining chariot come drawn by 4 gleaming angels whose glory no one born of woman could express nor look on their face, and angels went before the chariot. Book of Ezekiel. Book of Genesis. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. In the book of Ezekiel again, chapter 1, and when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them, and when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. So what we've got here, a smoking furnace, a burning lamp that seems to pass between places and pieces of rock. Book of Ezekiel again, whithersoever the Spirit was to go, they went. Thither was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. From the book of Exodus in the Bible, and the pillar of the cloud went before their face and stood behind them. The pillar of cloud. His going forth is from the end of heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it. And there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. The book of Nehemiah is talking about the circuit and a craft that can fly from the end of heaven, and there's nothing hidden from the heat of it. The book of Ezekiel again, and I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. In the book of Exodus, and it came to pass as Moses entered into the tabernacle, the cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord walked with Moses. And all the people saw the cloudy pillar stand at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose up and worshipped, every man in his tent door. In the book of John, then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at that land whither they went. So John is saying that this craft could move with such speed that it immediately, the ship, was at the land whither they went. I guess that's another biblical miracle. We just got to put it down to that. In Tony Bushby, he's a fine scholar of the secret hidden meanings in the Bible. Well, in his book, The Secret in the Bible, he has this to say. On September 25th, 1952, J.R. Josner, director of the International Academy of Sanskrit Research in Mysore, India, shocked the world when he revealed that Indian manuscripts, several thousand years old, recorded the existence of various types of aerial vessels that are called vimanas. An ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, translated by Wallace Budge at the British Museum in London, spoke of a vessel amongst the presents given to the Queen of Sheba, wherein one could travel by air. From the ancient books of the Hindus, we can read these passages. He boarded the aerial vehicle with Kara, which was decorated with jewels and the faces of demons, and it moved with noise resembling the sonorous clouds. Now remember, these books are many thousands of years old, much earlier than the Bible. The passages go on. So Ravana and Maricha boarded the aerial vehicle resembling a palace, Vimana, from the hermitage. Then the demoness brought the Pushpaka aerial vehicle and placed Sita on it by bringing her from the Ashoka forest, and she was made to see the battlefield with Triata. This aerial vehicle, marked with swan, soared into the sky with a loud noise. The word Vimana is often translated as flying swan. The ancient Mahabharata speaks of a Vimana as an aerial chariot with sides of iron and clad with wings. The Ramayana, this is another famous Indian text, describes a Vimana as a double-decker, circular or cylindrical aircraft with portholes on a dome. It flew with the speed of the wind and gave forth a melodious sound. In the Mahavira of Bhavabhuti, this is an 8th century Jain text, speaking of earlier records, so the Jains, who are already of the 8th century, are referring to much earlier texts. It says, an aerial chariot, the Pushpaka, conveys many people to the capital of Adhyodha. The sky is full of stupendous flying machines, dark as night, but picked out by lights with a yellowish glare. Then they say, now Vata's chariot's greatness, breaking goes it, and thunderous is its noise. To heaven it touches, makes light lurid, like a red fiery glare, and whirls dust upon the earth. Now what could these things possibly be talking about? From the Mahabharata again, direct translation. The airplane occupied by Salva was very mysterious. It was so extraordinary that sometimes many airplanes could appear to be in the sky, and sometimes there were apparently none. Sometimes the plane was visible and sometimes not visible, and the warriors of the Yadu dynasty were puzzled about the whereabouts of the peculiar airplane. Sometimes they would see an airplane on the ground, sometimes flying in the sky, sometimes resting on the peak of a hill, and sometimes floating on the water. The wonderful airplane flew in the sky like a whirling firebrand. It was not steady, even for a moment. And from the renditions of artists, who are people who illustrate the texts from the sacred books, here are two renditions of the flying palace in the sky, and on the right the flying swans carrying the royal personages from here to there. Here from the Ellora caves in India, and if there's an 8th wonder of the world, it might be these Ellora caves. One has to see it to believe it. Carved out of the solid granite and out of the solid limestone are these fascinating caves in Ellora, India. And here is just one relief where you can see that if you study this picture, it basically is in 3 levels. You have all of these characters standing on the ground at the bottom. Then just above their head you have a chariot or a horse and cart, and to the right you've got some trees. But then look what is happening on the 3rd level above the tree line. What's this? We got this large winged Vimana with the gods sitting inside it, and all the heads are looking upward. So you can draw your own conclusions from this. Now Dr. V. Rajhaven, and he should know, because he's the head of Sanskrit studies at the University of Madras, he has this to say. He says, 50 years of researching this ancient works convinces me that there are living beings on other planets and that they visited Earth as far back as 4000 BC. There is just a mass of fascinating information about flying machines, even fantastic science fiction weapons, that can be found in the translations of the Vedas, the Indian epics, and other ancient Sanskrit texts. Well, wait a minute, I thought all those Hindus and all those primitive people over in India, we're not to listen to them. They've got nothing to say to us about history or mythology. We can just, ignore all of that. In Egypt,
We know that the Egyptians had a great love of images, of hieroglyphics. Instead of writing like we do today, in the form that we do today, they chose to use these ideograms and these hieroglyphics. All right, here is the image of the hieroglyphic for the Egyptian word for God. Now that word is neter, N-E-T-E-R, neter. It's where we get our English word nature from. But that was their word for the gods. And when they drew the hieroglyphic, this is what it looked like. Now I think of the innumerable images you could use for the god or for the gods. Why choose this one? You have a wave of electrical type energy, very similar to the symbol for Aquarius in astrology, and beneath it you have this mysterious shape. Is somebody trying to tell us something? Carl Sagan, no less, he has this to say about the subject. He estimates that super technological starmen with interstellar spaceships may have visited Earth some 5,000 times since life first proliferated on Earth some 500 million years ago. And this is the skeptic. So mythology, history, abounds with information about the gods even having the access to not only powerful weapons and great psychic power, but that they even had the ability and command over the air. Jack Barringer, in his fine book Past Shock, says more than 30,000 written documents from all over the world tell of advanced beings who either came to Earth or who were already living on Earth. Well, the Bible seems to agree. Isaiah 13, they come from a far country, from the end of heaven, to destroy the whole land. Well, we might ask a couple of questions here. Who is they, and what is the end of heaven? Isaiah 6, who are these that fly in a cloud as the doves to their windows? Who indeed? In the book of Revelation, and the great dragon was cast down, the old serpent, he that is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was cast down to earth, and his angels were cast down with him. Cast down from where? From up there, from heaven. John Milton, more poetically of course, in his Paradise Lost, he puts it this way: so numberless were those bad angels, okay, so now we got bad angels, hovering on the wing under the cope of hell. He's referring, of course, to the famous fall of Lucifer. Now, one of the anomalies that is at least accepted somewhat historically and somewhat scientifically, because of the evidence that's also been found, is the concept of the first deluge. We talk about the pre-Diluvian era, or we talk about the time before the flood. Because every single culture, every single nation, every single race has descriptions of a great deluge. Now, it might sound controversial, but as I advocate in the book and in this program, the deluge was not a natural phenomenon. It was caused inadvertently by alien beings who, from distant reaches, entered into our solar system between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago. These so-called fallen angels were extremely scientifically advanced humanoid beings who came to Earth after being forced to exit their own planet or planets. They had been expunged by opposition forces and pursued across the galaxy into our solar system. Upon arrival, they set up an unmanned makeshift decoy center on the planet Tiamat, which once existed between Mars and Jupiter. But they took refuge on Earth in its many underground caverns. Now, Tiamat was a vast ocean planet in our solar system, known from antiquity as the second sun. So, in short, if you follow the mythologies, not only of the Celts, but of the world, you will discover that what they're saying is that we were visited on this planet about 50,000 years ago by a race of beings from another solar system. And they arrived in our solar system. They set up a dummy base for whatever reason, maybe to decoy their pursuers. But they actually arrived on this planet, the Earth. The existence of this planet, Tiamat, is controversial to say the least. But it was known in antiquity, again in mythology, it was known as the second sun. The word Tiamat is a Scandinavian term, and it means the great mother or the great ocean. But Tiamat, the planet Tiamat, the second sun, was also known by a plethora of other names. And you need to know some of these names because when you come across it in mythology, you won't know that they're actually talking about a celestial orb or a celestial body. It was once called Lucifer, Phaeton, Marduk, Vulcan, Rahab, Typhon, Tistria, and Kingu. These are various names. And of course, Revelation 8 tells us, and there fell a great star from heaven. Now, Joan d'Arc, in their book, The Late Great Planet Tiamat, has this to say: according to the harmonic rule known as Bode's law, a planet should exist between Mars and Jupiter, some 260 million miles from the Sun. Beginning in 1801, tiny rock and metallic objects were discovered to be orbiting the Sun at about this distance. Since then, several 100,000 large asteroids have been catalogued. It had earlier become evident that much of the material of this missing planet had been pulled into the orbits of Earth, Mars, and Jupiter as either meteors or orbiting satellites. That's right, Bode's law postulates that there is a missing body out there and that the asteroid belt is its remains. Chuck Meisler, who's very much a scholar who's been delving a lot into these celestial happenings, in his book he says, these asteroids are not ordinary pieces of rock and clouds of dust that never quite coalesce to become a legitimate planet, because that's what we're being told by the cosmologists. He says, no, they're not. Another estimate is that the original planet that was up there may have been 15 times larger than the Earth. The rings of Saturn may have come into being because of these cosmic upheavals. Moreover, the added debris from Tiamat increased the weight of the Earth and slowed the rotation, adding 5¼ days to the year of 360 days. So when it finally blew up or disintegrated, that debris can be charted, and its effect on the other planets can also be measured. Allen and Dallaire, in their book Cataclysm, say, if we elevate the moon to planetary status, as the Sumerians appear to have done, then we have a total of 10 planets orbiting the Sun today. On this basis, one planet is currently still missing from the earlier Sumerian total. Could there really have been another planet known to the Sumerians and yet unknown to us, or lost since their day? Now, the fact that it was called the second sun implies that it was a very radiant orb, and this is not so far-fetched that there could have been a second sun in our atmosphere, or at least something that was very radiant, because Venus, the morning star, which is the second planet from the Sun, is the third brightest object in the sky, so much so that it casts a distinct shadow on a moonless night. Now, it's probably likely that Tiamat, of course, was not a sun per se. It's more likely that the rays of the actual sun, when it was shining on the atmosphere of the planet Tiamat, and if Tiamat was also a watery planet, an ocean planet, perhaps it was the resplendence of the atmosphere of Tiamat that appeared to be, from Earth's vantage point at least, it was so bright that it was called by our ancestors a sun and thought of as being a sun. From the old Middle East book, the Enuma Elish, there's a passage that says, go and cut off Tiamat's life and let the winds convey her blood to the secret places. Tiamat reincarnated, that word, that image, that motif, reincarnated as a great primeval monster, a female hybrid, similar to the Medusa that the heroes had to go and destroy. But behind that story, behind those mythologies, is again mention of more celestial happenings. Go and cut off Tiamat's life and let her winds convey her blood to the secret places. This is actually a reference to the destruction of that planet. Again, Commons Beaumont, the great catastrophist and scholar from England, he says it permanently affected the world's climate. The destruction of Tiamat permanently affected the world's climate towards greater extremes of cold and damp, lengthened the solar year by enlarging the world's orbit. It shaped world history by compelling the flight of survivors to other less inhospitable climes, and led in considerable degree to the dispersion of the Aryans. It inundated the British Isles for a period to a great extent except the higher lands. It was the drowning of Atlantis. The flood immortalized the collision of a fallen planet, later termed Satan. So he is referring to it as Satan. In one of the most enigmatic and insightful of the ancient texts is the Book of Enoch, which has a great deal to say about these matters. In the Book of Enoch it says, "And behold, a star fell from heaven, and the children of the earth began to tremble and quake before them, and to flee from them. And again I saw how they began to gore each other, and to devour each other, and the earth began to cry aloud." This tumult in the heavens was causing havoc on earth. Now the cosmic upheavals, just like Beaumont was implying there, the cosmic upheavals that happen in the heavens above us were often stylized in myths as the conflicts between Rama and Ravana, let's say, or Horus and Set, or Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, if you are from the Persian persuasion, or Arthur and Mordred, or St. George and his dragon, you see, and Christ and Satan. A lot of these mythological adversarial conflicts are actually illustrations, motifs, portrayals of something that happened cosmically. This has now been accepted. Allen and Delaire, in their book Cataclysm, say that giant electromagnetic storms, lightning, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, stupendous hurricanes, abruptly displaced bodies of water, celestial bombardment, rains of astonishing volume, and a mighty flood are all quick-acting violent events. There's that key term, quick-acting. These are individuals who are now putting aside this idea of slow, gradual, gradations of change over vast areas of time. Now, these two characters who've written this book, Cataclysm, and who wrote the book When the Earth Nearly Died, who are these individuals? Well, D.S. Allen is Cambridge University science historian specializing in paleography. His colleague, J.B. Delaire, is Oxford University geologist, anthropologist, and museum creator of geology at the University of Southampton. These characters come out with a book, When the Earth Nearly Died, and their other one, Cataclysm, in the 90s. And the science is in to prove that the uniformitarian theories are just not sustainable, and that Darwinian theories are not sustainable. But how come we have not heard universal debate about these works? These are the top specialists in their field. And yet we go to high school, we turn on the television, we read in the journals and the magazines and the newspapers the same old regurgitated Royal Academy, Royal Society information, as if nothing has ever changed. In the book of Enoch, it says, "And in those days Noah saw the earth that it had sunk low, and its destruction was nigh. And he arose from thence and went to the end of the earth." Of course, I had questioned how did he manage to do that. Anyway, it says, "He went to the end of the earth and cried aloud to his grandfather Enoch. And Noah said bitterly 3 times, Hear me, hear me, hear me. And I, Enoch, said unto him, Tell me what it is that is falling upon the earth, that it is in such evil plight and shaken." Book of Enoch again, "And the moon shall alter her order, and not appear in her own time. And many chief stars shall transgress their prescribed order. And these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear as the seasons proper to them. And the whole order of the stars shall be concealed from the sinners, and evil shall be multiplied upon them, and punishment shall come upon them so as to destroy all." In Scandinavian mythology, they have a reference to it as well, although it's again figurative, it's mythological. They have the Midgard serpent, their great enemy, their great adversarial agency there, the Midgard serpent, blows so much poison that the whole sky and the sea are splattered with it. Here we have the essence of fable. Here we have the essence of allegory, that something stands in for something else. This is the way the ancients commemorated the histories that they knew. So for us to look back with contempt is outrageous. Allen and Delaire, in Cataclysm, traditionally the destruction was almost always associated with water in one form or another. That's right, not so much ice, but with water cataclysm. This is where the myth of the great deluge came from. They go on to say, ancient Mesopotamian texts repeatedly allude to the original watery nature of Tiamat. From such fragments, we may conclude that Tiamat was essentially a watery planet and that very large quantities of water were probably dispersed into space during Tiamat's destruction. Well, we can enlarge upon that by saying, yes, water, if the planet Tiamat for some mysterious reason gets destroyed and its waters, its ocean waters are blown out into space, well, outer space is a cryogenic chamber. So we can expect a great deal of it also to coalesce as ice and huge fragments of ice, not only as liquid water. And sure enough, if we turn to the myths again, we find that what scientists are only discovering now in the most modern of times, hey, the ancient legends, they were saying it all along. In the famous book of Taliesin, this is a Welsh bard, a Welsh writing, a Welsh scripture. Taliesin was the equivalent of Merlin. A lot of people have heard of Merlin. Well, they had a Welsh equivalent. He was called Taliesin. They had an Irish equivalent, as I said earlier on. There was an Irish bard upon which Merlin was entirely based. But Taliesin, the Welsh version, in the triads of Taliesin, in the poetry of Wales, it has this to say: I have been in the bark of Dylan. The bark means boat. I have been in the boat of Dylan, son of the wave, when the waters rose as lances, falling down from the skies into the exposed abyss. I mean, there you've got it all in one sentence. Now in Revelation we have this well-debated term wormwood. Well, taken in context of what I'm presenting here, let's revisit this. Wormwood, the famous wormwood, the bitter waters. Okay, it says in Revelation 8, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp. And the name of that star is called wormwood, and many men died of the water because they were made bitter. Bitter waters falling onto the earth. In Cataclysm, we have a passage from the mythologies of the Navajo Indians of North America. Long ago, they say, the Navajo ancestors were surprised one day to see animals of every type running from east to west. 4 days later, they saw a bright light in the east, and those sent to investigate it returned with the news that it was a vast flood of water proceeding in their direction. Next morning, this flood had drawn quite close, and filling the entire horizon, except the west, advanced like a chain of high mountains. Numerous surviving accounts describe the waters advancing like a colossal wave or wall of stupendous height and irresistible power. The relatively abrupt release of the waters piled up by Kingu and Phaeton's combined gravitational influence will have inevitably produced a deluge having precisely these characteristics. Now, Allen and Dallaire have hypothesized about Tiamat, but they're also more of the persuasion that it was a comet entering into our solar system by the name of Kingu that caused this. So again, it's up to you to do the research and discover which philosophy you believe. Was it an already existing planet in our solar system that destroyed? Or, as the Sumerians and Zecharia Sitchin and others are hypothesizing, was it the intervention of a cometary body that shook up our particular solar system? They go on to say the Zend Avesta, this is a very famous book in Persia. Zend Avesta mentions that when Tisthria assaulted Earth, it sent tremendous rains in which the drops were the size of saucers or of a man's head and were sometimes boiling hot. Now in the Norse Edda, during Odin, his battle with the Fenris wolf, the upper heaven is alleged to have been shattered, its wreckage plummeting to earth as hail and huge blocks of ice. So I would challenge anyone to explain what this is. Now you can see why so much of ancient mythology was just shunted to one side. Now you can understand why the marginalization campaign took place, because you simply can't explain it. Or at least you can't explain it with the tools that we've been given by the orthodox, by the official. If you're going to keep it in this pristine form, then it arises some very powerful questions. So the best thing to do is just trash it, and that's what's happened. And we have now in this world, in the new millennium, to help to restore this mythology, revisit the knowledge, the gnosis of our ancient forefathers, because we're not going to understand the times we're in. We're not going to understand the times that are coming unless we understand where we've come from, our origins, our roots. And that can only be done through a sound source. And the mythologies of the ancient world are certainly, in my opinion, a much more sound archive of knowledge than anything the religions of the world have ever been able to produce. In Genesis 7, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heavens were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth. All flesh died. Genesis 7, and the fountains of the great deep broke open, and the windows of heaven were open. So again, beautiful poetic language, but anyone can see what the reference is here. Revelation 8, and the fourth angel sounded, and a third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. Allen and Delaire. The gigantic worldwide tectonic disturbances of the late Pleistocene times occurred almost simultaneously on a near unimaginable scale, precisely what could be expected from a powerful external influence, but not from the Ice Age conditions conventionally believed to have existed then. Now, we need to understand something about any kind of celestial calamity, like what is being described here in the myths and in the scriptures. The impact of a comet, for instance. One comet can weigh up to 200,000 megatons, its impact being the power of 30,000 hydrogen bombs. And there are over 100,000 of these in Georgia and Carolina alone in America. Moreover, comet trails stretch behind the nucleus for millions of miles and contain every known gas. So when we're talking about percussion here, when we're talking about Carolina and Georgia and the whole of the world being pockmarked with cometary impacts of this kind, we can start to get an idea of the calamity that these myths are describing. For instance, the asteroid known as El Tanan, which struck the Earth, they say, 2.15 million years ago, but of course now we know to be a little bit suspicious of scientific dates, but even if you go by what is being said here, it says that between 1 to 4 kilometers in diameter was the crater. Had the explosive power of 100 billion tons of TNT, the impact blew a column of water 5 kilometers high. And had it hit land, it would have made a crater 40 miles across. 140 asteroids have hit land in the time that we know. So this thing hit the water, but if it had hit land, it would have made a crater 40 miles across. There's a giant crater in Antarctica, weighing in at around 13 billion tons and measuring 2.5 to 3.75 miles across. The meteorite smashed into the Earth approximately 700,000 years ago at a speed of 44,000 miles per hour. In 1992, an asteroid approached the Earth. It weighed about 20 million megatons. Its impact would be over 1,600,000 Hiroshima explosions. Now we can understand why the ancients say that the Grand Canyon is considered to have been caused in a single day. So when we get our minds around this kind of perspective, we can start to see that that's not as far-fetched. In Jim McCanney's interview in the Spectrum magazine of May 2003, he says this: "The magnetic field of the Earth is very much misunderstood. Most of it is caused by currents that flow around the Earth. It is not caused by some kind of magnet in our core. Most of our magnetic field is in the form of the form of electrical currents flowing around the planet in the solar wind, and in the Van Allen belt, and in other forms. That's why when a very highly charged electromagnetic comet comes by, it can so much affect us." In Paul Dunbavin's book Atlantis of the West, he says, "Comets may approach the Earth from all directions, with velocities varying from 11 kilometers per second to as much as 72 kilometers per second. The magnitude of these velocities becomes apparent when one considers that the average velocity of a rifle bullet lies in the range of 15 to 30 kilometers per second. At these high energies, even a body of very modest mass has a catastrophic potential." The historian and writer of the ancient world, Hesiod, in his Theogony, he writes, Typhon, remember that's another name for the planet Tiamat, Typhon out-topped all the mountains, and his head often brushed the stars. Such and so great was Typhon when, hurling kindled rocks, he made for the very heaven with hissing and shouts, spouting a great jet of fire from his mouth. At Mount Haemus he heaved whole mountains. A stream of blood gushed out of the mountain. So again, whether you think of it as being a comet or a portion of a remnant of the planet Tiamat falling into Earth's atmosphere, you can see that the ancients knew that it had caused incredible devastation throughout the world. In Lake Missoula, the Washington Indian legends of Washington State say that one summer morning the people were startled by a rumbling and a shaking of the earth. Then the sun was blotted out. Terrified people ran to the hills to get away from the pounding water. Then a rain of ashes began to fall, and it fell for several weeks. The Indians that are known as the Utes of Northern America, they have also legends pertaining to this. They say that the sun was shivered into 1,000 fragments, which fell to earth, causing a general conflagration. Then Tawats, that's their god, fled before the destruction he had wrought, and as he fled, the burning earth consumed his feet, legs, body, hands, and arms, until at last, swollen with the heat, the eyes of the god burst and tears gushed forth in a flood, which spread over the earth and extinguished the fire. So here again we have the conflagration, we have fire, and we have water, and we have the burning god, and so forth and so on. Very dramatic language, but again, talking about actual events that took place on this planet. In Chinese legends, we also read that the pillars supporting the sky crumbled, and the chains from which the earth was suspended shivered to pieces. Sun, moon, and stars poured down in the northwest, where the sky became low. Rivers, seas, and oceans rushed down to the southeast, where the earth sank. A great conflagration burst out, and flood raged. Wild beasts and terrible birds made men their prey. The Miztecs of South America, in a single day, they said, all was lost. Even the mountains sank into the water. Subsequently, there came a great deluge in which many of the sons and daughters of the gods perished. The Cato Indians of California, every day it rained, every night it rained. All the people slept and the sky fell. The land was not. For a very great distance there was no land. The waters of the oceans came together. Animals of all kinds drowned. Human beings and animals alike had been washed away. It was very dark. The Zuni Indians, they say, presently thick rain fell, quenching the fires and waters, washed the face of the world, cutting deep trains from the heights downwards, and scattered abroad the wrecks and corpses of stricken things and beings, or burying them deeply. Lo, they are seen in the mountains to this day. The Hopi Indians, the earth was rent in great chasms, and the water covered everything except one narrow ridge of mud, and across this the serpent deity told all the people to travel. The serpent deity told all the people to travel. Now, the Quiche Indians of Guatemala have this to say in their ancient mythologies. The waters were agitated by the will of Huracan. That's where we get our word hurricane, by the way. The heart of heaven, and a great inundation came. Masses of sticky material fell, the face of heaven was obscured, and a heavy, darkening rain began. There was a great noise above, as if by fire. Now men were seen running, pushing each other, and filled with despair. In their book, When the Earth Nearly Died, Allen and Dallaire, they say that in Siberia, the picture is everywhere one of appalling disorder, carnage, and wholesale destruction, with countless animals and plants frozen in positions of death ever since the day they perished. In Europe, immense herds of diverse animals utterly vanished off the face of the earth for no obvious biological reason. The magnitude of the biological extinctions achieved by the deluge almost transcends the imagination, they say. It annihilated literally billions of biological units of both sexes and every age indiscriminately. Only incredibly powerful floodwaters operating worldwide could have achieved such results, and only a flood produced by the means previously suggested could have operated globally. So again, my question, how could science go that wrong? Now it's all out of the bag. Now the top scientists with the same amount of resources go out there and find all of this information. Well, how come we haven't been hearing about this for the last hundreds of years? What was wrong with all of the other geologists and paleontologists? Here we have Charles Darwin, a quote from his journal while he was on the voyage of the HMS Beagle. This is the famous boat that he went round the world to make his original discoveries as a young man. Well, what we don't know, what we're not told, is he had some very serious questions about what he was seeing in the fossil record and in the flora and the fauna. He writes, "What then has exterminated so many species and whole genera? The mind is at first irresistibly hurried into the belief of some great catastrophe, but thus to destroy animals both large and small, we must shake the entire framework of the globe. No lesser physical event could have brought about this wholesale destruction, not only in the Americas, but in the entire world. Certainly, no fact in the long history of the world is so startling as the wide and repeated extermination of its inhabitants." And there we have Darwin almost himself. This is going to be the person that is considered the champion of uniformitarianism. This is the champion of the theory of evolution. And yet in his own writings, from his earliest and first observations, he's almost a catastrophist. He's almost but saying that this thing was worldwide, this thing was immense, and this thing was very swift. Whatever it was, it happened rapidly. Henry Howarth, one of the great scholars, in his book The Mammoth and the Flood, from 1887, he writes, "The mammoth and its companions perished by some widespread catastrophe which operated over a wide area, and not through the slow process of the ordinary struggle for existence, not the result of gradual accumulation, but the result of one of nature's hecatombs on a grand and widespread scale, when a vast fauna perished simultaneously." Paul S. Martin, in his book, Who or What Destroyed Our Mammoths? Animals, he says, that have been native for millions of years disappeared under circumstances that were suspiciously sudden. The loss of over 30 genera of large mammals and many other species of large animals in North America alone. Well, judging from the impact of those comets that we just heard about, one can understand that the casualty rate would be like this. R.W. Graham, in his book, Evolution of New Ecosystems and the End of the Pleistocene, says, at the end of the Pleistocene, about 10,000 years ago, there was an extinction event that decimated the large terrestrial mammalian herbivores and carnivores of North America, South America, and Australia. In North America alone, more than 32 genera of mammals became extinct. And he says the cause of this extinction is debatable. And look at the date that he's giving there, a mere 10,000 years ago. Robert Milton, in his monumental book, Shattering the Myth of Darwinism, he gives descriptions very much along the same lines. In 1878, miners at Bernissart, a small village in the Mons coalfield of southwest Belgium, made a spectacular discovery when they uncovered a fissure in the coal seam packed full of intact dinosaur skeletons. At a depth of 322 meters, 39 skeletons of the dinosaur Iguanodon were recovered from a fissure 100 feet high, many of them complete. The most striking thing about these creatures is that they measured 10 meters in length, stood several meters high, and weighed in the region of about 2 tons apiece. For their bodies to be rapidly buried would require rates of deposition thousands or even millions of times greater than the average 0.2 millimeters per year proposed by the uniformitarians. So you're talking about fallacy, and then there's capital F fallacy. You're talking about lies, and then there's capital L lies. And it's all coming out of the bag now. Milton goes on to say, in the Siwalik hills north of Delhi, they contain extraordinarily rich beds crammed with fossils, packed with the jumbled bones of scores of extinct species. These animals must have been killed by some singular event which took place on land. And whatever the nature of the event, it resulted not only in catastrophic extinction of many species, but also the formation of beds of sediment, thousands of feet thick. Darwin, again, the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be argued against my theory. So here's the proponent, so-called, of uniformitarianism, of evolution, of the origin of the species, having severe doubts. He's saying there's something seriously wrong in the record. Something seems to have disturbed the fossil record because there's no simple chart. There's no simple record in a nice orderly progression. Far from it, in fact. Professor Frank C. Hibben, this is the Department of Anthropology in the University of New Mexico, says, although the formation of the deposits of muck is not clear, there is ample evidence that at least portions of this material were deposited under catastrophic conditions. Mammal remains are for the most part dismembered and disarticulated. Twisted and torn trees are piled in splintered masses, and at least 4 considerable layers of volcanic ash may be traced in these deposits, although they are extremely warped and distorted. He goes on to say, one of the most interesting theories of the Pleistocene end is that which explains this ancient tragedy by worldwide earth-shaking volcanic eruptions of catastrophic violence. Interspersed in the muck depths, and sometimes through the very piles of bones and tusks themselves, are layers of volcanic ash. There is no doubt that coincidental with the end of the Pleistocene, animals, at least in Alaska, there were volcanic eruptions of tremendous proportions. Toxic clouds of gas from volcanic upheavals could well cause death on a gigantic scale. So wait a minute, I thought it was about ice action. I thought we had stuff about millennia-long ice ages. And now the top scholars in the field are talking about volcanoes and fire and rain and water from the heavens? That's right. According to the experts, Harvard University, Dr. Donald Menzel is saying, wait a minute, it is not heat that causes ice action. If there was ice action in this world, it is not even caused by cold, but by heat. If solar variability causes the ice ages, I should prefer to believe that increased warmth brought them on, whereas diminution of heat caused them to stop. Well, now we're even on the reverse track of what we've been told for ages. Allen and Dallaire, they agree. So even if they existed, the huge ice sheets of the Pleistocene times need great heat for their formation, an element conceivably provided by many volcanoes erupting simultaneously. Such an event, if it actually occurred, must also have generated tremendous atmospheric pollution and hurricane-force winds. The frightful hurricanes were doubtless primary factors in the demise of so much insect and bird life, for what other agency, other than extremely violent winds, could have brought together in one place such dissimilar avian species? Those who've spent time to look into these theories of catastrophism know that all over the cliffs of Dover, the caves in England and Ireland and all throughout the world, there birds and insects and other flying mammals are found, their bones are just heaped, millions of tons of bones heaped on top of each other, birds and fauna which do not normally coexist in the same region. But how did they all end up lining the shores and beaches of the northern countries? In the North American legends and in the Persian legends, we read very much the same thing. In the Persian Zend Avesta, their holy book, it says that the sea boiled, and all the shores of the oceans boiled, and all of the middle of it boiled. The star Tistria, say the legends, let a stream of fire flow towards earth, and filled our earth with its devouring heat. great clouds appeared, say the Kashka tales of the Kashka people, great clouds appeared, such a great heat came, and finally the water boiled. People jumped into the streams and lakes to cool themselves, and they died. And the North American Indian legends say it grew very hot. Many animals jumped into the water to save themselves, but the waters began to boil. And of course, the rapid cooling of this immense heat, once it is hot, then the rapid cooling of that, the side effect of that, can be that ice is then caused. Allen and Dallaire are convinced of this fact. They're claiming that it's an age of water that we should be looking at, not ice. The deposits, the drift, the striations, the polishing, the fluting, the gouging, the scourging, the scouring, and the organic eradications were caused not by ice but by water. You see, there's often the geologists will say that, look, all you have to do is look at the rocks. All you have to look at as these erratic boulders. And all you have to do is look at the surface of the topography and the striations on them, the grooves and the scouring. That must, of course, been composed and created by ice, just like the great moraines are, just like the great river valleys and so forth. But these individuals are saying, no, water can cause this also. If comparatively modest cloudbursts can produce such scour effects, the prodigious rains and the enormous aqueous movements associated with the Phaeton disaster must have denuded the landscapes infinitely more acutely. Soil and softer surfaces would have been removed from whole regions to bury hillsides and entire valleys elsewhere. The ice action which has been recorded was the effect of the deluge and the superheating of the atmosphere from electromagnetic storms, earthquakes, and global volcanic eruptions. All of this was caused by the superheating and not by ice action. No satisfactory theory, they say, has yet been proposed which actually explains what caused the ice age in the first place. There appear to be no terrestrial conditions as we know them capable of producing the heat necessary to evaporate vast quantities of water to form the continental-sized ice sheets. So they're saying, where did this heat come from? The demise of mammoths and other animals was not caused by the onset of glacial conditions, as many authorities would have us believe, for the evidence shows that they were in most cases already dead before they were frozen. Therefore, instead of a slow, gradual freeze and building up of glacial conditions over a prolonged period, as is generally proposed, refrigeration was remarkably sudden and unrelenting. This was another of Phaeton's legacies. So here you have these individuals from Oxford and Cambridge not only refuting the ice action and the whole concept of official ice age theory, but you have them linking it, and this is most important, linking it to celestial events, the destructions of stars or the coming in of comets, the intervention of celestial bodies. And Commons Beaumont, who was speculating on this much earlier than any of these individuals, he says, what? No ice age which came and went, spreading over hundreds of thousands of years, as all good geologists proclaim? No smothering ice sheets which enveloped the British Isles and much of the northern parts of the continent, changed the climate to Arctic conditions? No, nothing of the sort. There was, admittedly, a tremendous convulsion of nature, which had the most direful effect on the inhabitants of Scandinavia, the British Isles, and those in northern Asia. It resulted in giving us, it is true, bitter cold, tremendous floods, and cruel dampness. That it affected the climate of the north, in the north, adversely and permanently, cannot be denied. And it did other things as well, but no ice age. It was an event, he said, sudden, rapid, devastating, and appalling in its magnitude, its destructiveness. It was a celestial impact of an immense cometary body. It rained or disturbed rocks, stones, boulder clay, till, gravel, sand, and other materia over great areas, utterly obliterating certain parts, elevating others, and entirely missing some regions. It created islands, drowned others, caused immense tidal waves, which swallowed up coastal lands, consumed huge spaces with electric waves, set up volcanoes and swept away cities and largely populated districts, almost in a flash. Commons Beaumont, as I said, along with Emanuel Velikovsky, was one of the most lambasted and marginalized of all researchers in any field at any time. The collective and unavoidable messages of these and other innumerable details is that, at some stage, colossal masses of water played a very important, although not the only, role in affecting these changes. This again suggests that the many surviving accounts of a worldwide deluge long ago may yet be found to rest upon a substratum now dimly remembered fact. In fact, all you really have to do is look at the etymology of the words for the sun and the moon to corroborate what we are proclaiming here. The word sun, which comes from the Latin sol, is a phoneme that we find in the word soul, solo, solitary, and other words like that. Because the word sol actually means alone or solitary. Well, the original word for the moon, luna, also is a derivation of the word alone. Luna, the lone one. Why are they called the alone ones? Because they understood, the ancients understood, that they are alone now. Because they had a cousin, they had a twin, the second sun. And the second sun is no longer there. So from that time onwards, in order to commemorate this celestial cataclysm, the sun and the moon were called the alone ones. That's their title, that's their name. In fact, the very words we use today to signify travesty also commemorate exactly what we are talking about. The word disaster comes from the two words dis, which means to be without or to be with loss, and aster is the word for star, no star. Disaster literally means no star. And the word catastrophe also means kata, to break down or to destroy, and strophe, which was star. So the destruction or the breaking up of a star. We use these same terms today to denote when something horrible, calamity has happened to us. Now, of course, it may seem quite far-fetched to accept any of this, and certainly the idea that torrents of water, ice and rain and what have you, is pouring into our atmosphere, into the earth, because to actually accept that is also to accept the fact that before this water presence was felt on our earth, that there may have been substantially much less water and probably no oceans as we know it today. That's a pretty far-fetched concept, is it not? But yet, that's what the ancient mythologies are telling us, that before the waters came down from the heavens, our earth was, relatively speaking, without a lot of water. There's a concept known to geologists as Pangaea. This concept is that the fact that Europe and Africa were originally coterminous with North and South America. That means all the land masses made a supercontinent called Pangaea, the whole earth. At this time, one could travel anywhere on earth without hindrance, and there was global interaction and commerce. Due to these catastrophes and earth changes, the biospheric radiation, pressure, magnetism, and water content of the atmosphere was dramatically affected. This in turn affected the biology of earth inhabitants, who suffered greatly shorter lifespans and the reduction of their resistance to disease in environmental changes. Well, that can be understood. Vast changes to the flora and the fauna, upheavals on the earth, not to mention the emotional disturbance, psychological trauma that must have caused. In the Holocene period, what is known as the post-diluvian, that means the period after all of this upheaval, we have from the Babylonian Atrahasis scripture, we read, "The womb of the earth did not bear, vegetation did not sprout, the broad plain was choked with salt. For 1 year they ate couch grass. The third year came, their features were altered by hunger." In the Bundahish, it says, "Poison and venom of the noxious creatures were all mixed up with the water, and the waters became quite salt." In Latin philosophy, we have ver perpetuum, the perpetual spring. Various remarkable and often quite unbelievable characteristics were attributed to it, such as it being a place the human inhabitants are in the prime of life, with no aging or senility. This is in Fry's book, The Great Code. Allen and Dallaire say that the Roman writer Ovid stated that during the reign of the legendary king Cronus, springtime was perennial. Virtually every commentator of antiquity on this topic agreed that this lost age was a golden one, and the earth a veritable paradise. So there we have a significant break. The Ice Age break, which is known to scientists. But the mythologists are talking about something quite different. They're talking about two distinct ages. An age in which there was a golden age, a paradisical place where people lived long lives and were hale and healthy. And then quickly after these cataclysms came something quite different, when man lost his power and was changed psychologically and even physically, and when the earth was unrecognizable. In more recent times, we have the works of the strange and enigmatic Charles Fort. This was an individual who was independently wealthy and decided to go around the world literally gaining evidence and charting all of the strange anomalies. And in his works, he charted all of the different stories and records and tales and eyewitness accounts of phenomena that has fallen from the sky. And he charted ice and oil and frozen and even live fish, all of the different accounts from all over the world of debris falling from out of the sky. And as I said, even live fish. This has perplexed people for a long, long time. How come that village people would go out and see live fish flopping around outside, and even frogs that would fall right out of the clear blue sky in ancient times and even more recently? Well, we can understand that if there was a planet out there which was mostly oceans, saltwater oceans, it would also have life on it. So can we really conceive that the oceans of our world, they're not even of our world? All that salt water? In more recent time, scientists have even found live bacteria that doesn't originate on our planet. Bacteria that's inhabiting the ionosphere, that doesn't originate there. The fact of the matter is that the Van Allen belt, or the asteroid belt more correctly, when it approaches in orbit our trajectory, the orbit of our planet, when the two coincide or come very close together and the asteroid belt approaches the Roche field of our planet, some of that debris is still caught and it enters into our atmosphere and falls to the earth in this manner, as Charles Fort so wonderfully catalogued. Recent analysis of NASA images of large icy bodies entering and melting through friction in Earth's upper atmosphere not only contribute to our planet's water supply, but indicate, through weighing as much as 20 tons each, the source of fallen ice blocks from space. So here we are, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, scientists would utterly refute this, and yet here we are with the new NASA images. We've actually seen this taking place. Astronomers announced the discovery just outside Earth's present orbit of a circumsolar ring of asteroidal dust in resonant lock with our planet. The plane of the ring's orbit differs from the Earth, whereby the two intersect erratically and partially at that. The ring seems to be a likely source of much of the 10,000 tons of extraterrestrial trail dust thought to fall on Earth annually, and probably of a high percentage of the countless meteorites, not meteors that is, just meteorites, which also arrive every year. Now, I believe, in my researches into these ancient mythologies, that we do read about it, but we don't know that we do. I actually believe that our concept in religion and in art and in mythology and in folk tales, our concept of hell, our concept of the bottomless pit, of the underworld, of Avernus and Tartarus, and the inferno, the abyss of purgatory, and so forth. All of this is a racial memory, coming from the time when not there was a hell or hollow earth, or some sort of bottomless pit, but that the earth itself was in tumult, and that volcanoes were going off, and water was falling from the heavens, and everything was in upheaval, and the stinking corpses of bodies, putrefying bodies, and starvation, and emaciated corpses, and howling dogs and wolves. This cataclysm, which is in our racial memory, I believe, gave rise to the theory known today as hell. I mean, it's got all the ingredients. We've got torrential burning rains, furious magnetic storms, lightning and hail, volcanoes and earthquakes, foul fogs and steams, darkened skies. The earth's rotation slows or stops. There's clamor in the heavens, mangled vegetation, the howling and dying animals and the putrefying corpses, as I said, and the plague and decay. All of this, what would this contribute to? It would stay within, it would be burned in the imagination of the collective psyche. And also conversely, we'd have mythologies like the sacred mountain, because whatever mountains there were, they would be probably the only areas of refuge. So people would ascend the mountain, which is why all cultures hold the mountain sacred as a refuge. And they also hold horned animals as sacred, like they do in India with a sacred cow. But many other cultures hold the horned animal sacred. Well, they're the only animals that could accompany the human race into the high reaches of the peaks of these different mountains. So of course, humans in their traumatized state would have thought of these animals as being companions, and therefore even later, in later dates, they would have been worshipped and revered, and there would have been prohibitions against killing those animals that had given them food and given them clothing during the times of great upheaval. Now, these cataclysms that Alan and Dallaire and so many of these other theorists are talking about, the one piece that I have brought to this particular subject that is seemingly missing, still missing from the whole picture, is that the destruction of the planet Tiamat was not in fact formed or created by some intervening, careering comet from the nether reaches of space. And the planet Tiamat did not of its own just happen to explode. As I said, the visiting parties, these visiting alien beings that came and put up their dummy base on Tiamat, were being pursued. And it was their pursuers who, upon approaching our solar system and thinking that their enemy was on the planet Tiamat, these are the beings that I believe, and if you read the mythologies, there's a lot of evidence for this, destroyed the planet Tiamat artificially, just incinerated it, blew it up. And this is the reason why that planet was destroyed. Now, the beings that were being pursued, we can't know right away if they were talking good or bad. These are pantomime terms that really hold no currency. How do we know that the pursuers were not just as pernicious or negative or what have you as the people that they were following? We have to leave that aside for now. But the fact of the matter is, they innocently thought that the people that they were pursuing were on the planet Tiamat, and as a result, they took an extreme action and decimated the entire planet, causing this upheaval. But what had happened in fact is that these fallen angels, these beings that are spoken about in all the ancient legends, they had actually taken refuge on Earth, beneath the tree line and deep under the earth, in caverns of the earth that were already created and some that they created for themselves. And this brings us to the fascinating concept of the hollow earth. Now, hollow earth was recently rediscovered, or at least re-theorized, after the flight of Admiral Byrd, who in his flight across Antarctica is said to have seen these entrances to the hollow earth. And later on in his memoirs that were released, there was a lot of evidence for this. But it was known in ancient times. Caves and deep underground passages are nothing new. In the ancient world, we have the Serapeum. In Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval's great book, Talisman, they write about the Serapeum. There is something almost unnatural and something almost superhuman here, they say. For what is seen all along the huge tunnels and corridors are dozens and dozens of enormous sunken niches, the size of large living rooms, in which were inserted massive granite sarcophagi that once contained the mummified corpses of the Apis bulls. The size and weight of these sarcophagi, some over 60 tons and cut from a single block of granite, fire the imagination, for at least on face value, it is very difficult to see how they were brought down there in the first place, let alone maneuvered into the niches. In Malta, the megaliths there are the oldest in Europe, dating as early as 5,000 years. The hypogeum was cut from living rock and descends into the earth. The Gardala cave was found full of animal remains, as if from a major cataclysm. Of the 7,000 skeletons found, only 6 skulls remain, indicating that someone has been seeking to prevent serious investigation of the site. In Genesis, in the Bible, in Genesis 4, we hear some hints also relating to hollow earth concept. In Genesis 4 it says, "And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me this day from the face, that means the surface, of the earth, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And Cain went out of the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, the Victorian writer Edward Bulwer-Lytton, he was also a member of some secret societies like the Order of the Golden Dawn and whatnot. In his book, The Coming Race, he describes the existence of a utopian society of advanced beings who lived in tunnels and caverns beneath the surface of the earth in a land called the Vrilya. These beings, known as the Ana, were forced into the inner earth because of earth changes, specifically a flood, which destroyed their civilization thousands of years before the biblical cataclysm. Does he know something we don't know? In his book, The Coming Race, in 1867, Wentworth Little founded the English Rosicrucian Society. He was in contact with the German Rosicrucians. Little recruited his followers, that's up to 144 people, from the ranks of the higher-ranking Freemasons. One of his disciples was Bulwer-Lytton, who was a learned man celebrated throughout the world for his novel, The Last Days of Pompeii. He also wrote The Coming Race, which featured a mystical, pre-Nazi group in Germany. This Berlin group called itself the Luminous Lodge, or the Vril Society. Vril, like the Force, has enormous energy potential. They lived in caves and would emerge to reign over the surface world. In 1 Samuel 28, and the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. In Aeschylus, he writes, No craft they knew, with woven brick and jointed beam to pile the sunward porch, but in the dark earth burrowed and housed like sunless ants in sunless caves. In David Icke's book, Children of the Matrix, he refers to Cappadocia. 36 underground cities have been discovered in Cappadocia so far, and some are huge complexes going down 8 levels. The ventilation systems are so efficient that even 8 floors down, the air is still fresh. 30 vast underground cities and tunnel complexes have also been found near Derinkuwa in Turkey. Tony Bushby in A Secret of the Bible. Historical documents recorded that during the 20th century, staggering discoveries not spoken of today were made at Giza and Mount Sinai, and Egyptian rumors of the discovery of another underground city within a 28-mile radius of the Great Pyramid abound. The Apache Indians, they tell stories of tunnels between their land and the city of Tiahuanaco, and claim that their ancestors traveled for years by this route. The Indian chiefs also assured that the tunnels were carved out by rays that destroy the living rock, and that their creators were beings who live near the stars. The Hopi Indians speak of a plumed serpent god called Baho Linkinga, and an underground world called Sipapuni, where they say their tribe originated. So we're talking about the Hopi Indians actually saying that they originated from an underground precinct, underground worlds. And Warren Schufelt discovered the underground tunnels beneath Los Angeles, which the Hopi Indians had for centuries believed were inhabited. That's right. The whole of Los Angeles is networked with underground caves that stretch all the way down to Cusco and into Brazil. G.E. Kincaid in 1909 apparently discovered a massive underground city that was cut out into a wall of the Grand Canyon with a precision equaled only to that of the Great Pyramid. The highly advanced civilization that inhabited this subterranean city was of unknown origin. A Smithsonian Institution team discovered hundreds of rooms, some as small as the average living room and others as large as several hundred feet in length and breadth. It was estimated that the arena explored so far by the team could have comfortably housed 50,000 people. This is from John Rhodes, Human-Reptilian Connection. He's an expert in underground caverns and so forth. The Navajos, Coyoteros, Pueblos report Their only food was meat, for all kinds of game were closed up with them. Then the men and animals began to climb up from their caves, and their coming up required several days. The earth was at this time very small, and the light as scanty as it had been down below, for there was as yet no heaven, nor sun, nor moon, nor stars. In India, there is an ancient belief still held by some in a subterranean race of serpent people who dwell in the cities Patala and Bhogovati. According to the legend, they wage war on the kingdom of Agartha. The Nagas, according to the deep dwellers, are described as a very advanced race or species with a highly developed technology. They also harbor a disdain for human beings, who they are said to abduct, torture, interbreed, and even to eat. And one might want to notice the prevalence of hollow earth motifs in movies, not just of Hollywood, but of movies in general. We have a great deal of movies in this world that feature hollow earth, some of them very famous, and people watch them all the time and never think of it. And yet they're seeing constant reference to this, not just in science fiction movies, but in many others. Richard Sauder is an expert on this theory and has written 2 books, Underground Bases and Tunnels and Underwater Bases and Tunnels. These are fine books and definitely should be perused. He gives thorough understanding of how even in modern age there's a lot of drilling and research into the hollow earth concept. In Paris, there are 6 million corpses buried directly under Paris in the 156 miles of caves which were discovered there. These are said to be limestone caves. However, it is known that many were hand-carved. These caves and labyrinths are 60 feet below the sewers and the metro. The corpses and bones came from the tombs and graves in Paris, which were disturbed at one point. But that was a later problem of the corpses and the graves being opened. The caves have been there for millennia, and nobody can account for how they got there. And you can take trips and go right down there on a guided tour and take a look. In Revelation 9, when he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. And out of the smoke locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God upon their foreheads. They were not given power to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. And the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes a man. During those days men will seek death, but not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. So again, the concept of the abyss is a very primordial Christian image, and from the abyss comes some sort of entity administering justice. The locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. Their hair was like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like the breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses, and chariots rushing to battle. They had tails and stings like scorpions, and in their tails they had the power to torment people for 5 months. They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon. Now in Job 12, we read, "Dead things are formed from under the water, and the inhabitants thereof." This is the Bible, Job 12. "Dead things are formed from under the water and from the inhabitants thereof." Now if you get the Bible and you look at the commentary that goes with these Bibles, you can get a Bible that has up to 26 different interpretations of every passage. So if you get an annotated Bible or one like the Companion Bible that has extensive footnotes, and look at this Bible reference, you'll find something very interesting. The comment to this particular passage, Job 12, is this: "The place where the Rephaim stay, which is beneath the waters." Dead things, in Hebrew, is Rephaim, the offspring of the fallen angels, akin to the Nephilim. As Rephaim, they were well known and are often mentioned. It is variously translated as dead, deceased, or giants. These Rephaim are to have no resurrection. They are the 7 times dead. Yes, and they live under the water, according to the Bible. In Genesis 4, "And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened up her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth." In Amos 9, "Though they dig into hell, thence shall mine hand take them. Though they climb up into heaven, thence will I bring them down." So you can actually dig into hell. "Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea," says Revelation 12. In Revelation 9 it says, "Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, of things in heaven, and things in earth, and things under the earth." In Exodus 20, we have this very famous prohibition. "You shalt not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is under the water of the earth." So the Judeo-Christian paradigm in the Decalogue, they have this mysterious prohibition. I mean, this prohibition comes before even the one that says, "Thou shalt not kill." And it's very specific, is it not? It's saying you won't make a picture, you will not draw a painting of what? Of things that are on the earth, of things that are in the earth, of things that are in the water. And we've all heard the folkwives' tale, the motto, "The devil and the deep blue sea." Now there are many books on this incredible subject. Etadorfa, which was written by John Uri Lloyd. He was of the Lloyd family of Detroit, I believe, a very wealthy person who had a great deal to say, Hollow Earth theory, because he said that he was actually down there. In Kentucky, he was taken below. This is at the 1800s. American businessman and millionaire who's written a fantastic book called Etadorfa, which can still be found. And there are many other fine books on this subject, and if you do a search on the internet, you will even find some fascinating websites going into this whole theory of the hollow earth. Repeatedly, throughout all of the mythologies of the world, we hear about the giants, men of great stature. In Deuteronomy 9, we read, "A people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, whom thou knowest, and of whom thou hast heard say, Who can stand before the children of Anak?" Well, all over the world we have giantism. Here's a couple of pictures from the Far East and from China and Manchuria, where we have gigantic beings well in excess of 8 feet. In July 1877, says Charles Berlitz in his book, The World of the Odd and Awesome, 4 prospectors moved through along the hills of the Spring Valley near Eureka, Nevada. Using their picks, the prospectors soon chipped out human legs and foot bones that have been encased in solid quartzite. From knee to heel, the bone was 39 inches long. And Valdemar Valerian, in his Matrix 2, he says a human skeleton 17 feet tall was discovered at Garganyan in the Philippines. And in Australia, Rex Gilroy, incredible researcher into this exact field, has discovered remarkable remains of beings that were on this planet of enormous size. You can get into the internet and do a search on Rex Gilroy and study what this man has discovered down in Australia. In the New Nation magazine, we find that huge corpses and skeletons have been unearthed. Recently, gas exploration is going on in the desert of southeast region of Saudi Arabia. This desert region is called the Empty Quarter. And this body has been found by Aramco exploration team. Saudi military took over this whole area, and nobody is allowed to go into this region except the Saudi Aramco personnel. Saudi government has kept it very secret, but some military helicopters took pictures from the air. And one of them he runs on the internet there in Saudi Arabia. Here's another picture of the same excavation. In Mesa Verde, in New Mexico, corpses were discovered 9 feet in height, possessing hands of 6 digits. Well, if the myths are right, and if these calamities in the heavens were created by visitors to our planet, we have a question. What's their name and what's their address? Do the myths reveal where these individuals come from or any more information about them? They've been called by many names. Nephilim, Anakim, Anunnaki, the fallen angels, the necromancers, the Nagas. The Celtic people refer to them as the Nadreds. And more recently they've been referred to as the Brotherhood of the Snake or the Serpent people. Cyclopeans and Prometheans, Olympians. One can pick a variety of names depending on what culture you're studying. In the Bible and in the Semitic tradition, they're known as the Nephilim. A word translates as giants, from the root nafal, meaning fallen ones. Most modern translations or versions of the Bible have left this word untranslated. Now, when the Greek Septuagint was made, the Nephilim was retranslated as gegenes, which means the earthborn. The word may also come from nephel, which means bad or strange birth, or from kenephilim, which means the serpents. So there's that serpent connection again. The etymology of Nephilim is uncertain. The following explanations have been advanced with mixed reception. First, it may derive from nifal, of the verb meaning to be extraordinary or extraordinary men. It may be derived from the verb ne nafal or napal, meaning fall or the fallen ones from heaven, i.e. supernatural beings, or could be also morally fallen men. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia defines it as meaning unnaturally begotten men, or bastards, from nepel, abortion or miscarriage. So actually it doesn't sound very holy when you really get into the etymology of it all. But as I said, one of the terms that's been used by more modern writers like William Bramley and Mark Pinkham is the serpents of wisdom. And given the fact that the serpent is so prevalent on so many places of the world, I mean, the serpent image has appeared in sculptures and in wall reliefs and in paintings in lands where snakes never existed, like Ireland. So how did the people even know to paint a serpent or a snake? And if we look down through history, we see so much usage of the symbol of the serpent. Here in the Hindu Vedic tradition, there's an enormous reliance on the iconography and symbol of the serpent. In Mexico, it adorns the walls of the great temple structures. But here in the Grecian and Latin tradition, we often see hybrid creatures, or we see a human in a conflict situation with a serpent. This kind of entity is called Abraxas, who is the head of a cock, and the tails, the feet, is designed as a serpent motif. This is one of the gods of the ancient world, ancient Europe. Here we have a symbol of the baboon god, who I think is representing the human being, venerating the serpent god, who is, of course, the wise one. And the serpent god is offering the ape-like god or ape-like creature a globe of knowledge. But wherever we look in the world, there's a tremendous prevalence of the serpent motif. Or the coiled serpent, or the intertwined serpents. These are images also on the bottom left there from the Picts of northern Scotland. They also made a lot of use of astronomical symbols. Again, the idea that there's a conflict, that the hero has to go forth and do battle with a dragon or a serpent. I mean, we seem to accept these quite blithely without actually wondering, where did this come from? And here in this picture, you even see the tree. The perennial mythologies of the tree, the female, and the serpent, and the hero doing battle. Here it's more explicit. Here's Zeus with his thunderbolt literally doing battle with a serpent-shaped person. Part man, part serpent. Again, the same thing here. And here in a Roman bas-relief, you can see the same thing happening here of the god. And if you look on the right where it's an enlargement of this, you'll see that the man is depicted as having the feet of a serpent. In the Native American Indian culture, we not only find images on the walls of the great mesas, we not only find beings of great stature, but again, we always find the symbols of the serpent or the twin serpent. Native American Indian culture is, of course, replete with the serpent, and there's really been no satisfactory explanation of these images, of these strange beings, or of the serpents that are in close proximity. But sure enough, here they are. All over the Native American lands, especially of the higher, more advanced Native American Indian cultures, there's enormous emphasis on that. And as I said, the names of cherubim and seraphim actually represent, they actually come from the words flaming or fiery serpents. But angels, as we know them today, later in Judeo-Christianity, they were always showed anthropomorphically, meaning with a human form. But they originate from the more Middle Eastern, Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Babylonian. They were never shown as a human. They were always shown as theriomorphic, with the head of an animal or like a bird. Now, Serapis, one of the most revered gods of Roman times and Grecian times, this Greek god was a personification of Osiris and was the basis of Jesus Christ. The word Serapis comes from seraphim, which meant shining serpent. In fact, even the word Hellenes, which is how the Greeks referred to themselves, they weren't called Greeks, they knew themselves as the Hellenes, also means the shining ones. And as we noted earlier, Pythagoras, the keeper of all the knowledge, Pythagoras, the mathematician, the initiator, the name actually means, I am the Python. And in Arthurian tradition, we have the Pendragon, the head of the dragons. And Tony Bushby says, as long as humanity kept records of its existence, serpents were used as emblems of the intelligence of God. In ancient times, as widespread, as diverse as Australia, China, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Babylonia, Sumeria, Egypt, India, and Central America, serpents were feared and worshipped as gods for thousands of years. If there is a common origin to the mythology of the serpent, it may have developed at the Great Pyramid of Giza. To this day, serpents or dragons signify divine heritage and royalty in many Asian countries, while in the West, the serpent represents wisdom and knowledge. Among nearly all ancient peoples, the serpent was accepted as the ultimate symbol of wisdom or salvation. Now, the visitors emerged after the cataclysm and took up residency on the continent of Appalachia, where they founded their great city and empire of Atlantis. Initially, they set to work adjusting to the new planet and made elaborate astronomical calibrations in order to establish where exactly they were, and to aid them when they eventually made to vacate the Earth in their crafts. They enlisted the assistance of Earth's indigenous peoples to construct the astronomical earthworks. That's why we have all these wonderful monuments and all these incredible megalithic sites and the calendars. As I said earlier, it is known by students of these subjects that these earthworks are aligned to the constellations. Well, if you are visiting our planet or you've come here against your will, you've flown maybe millions of miles across the universe, certainly from a different planetary system or galaxy, and you have arrived on our little planet, which is very unfamiliar to you. You've gone through an upheaval. You've been sequestered and hiding yourself under the earth, and then you emerge, things are going to be different. A planet is missing from the solar system, and everything is in upheaval, just as the myths have been explaining. So what do you set about doing? You set about trying to calibrate and find out where you are on this planet, to re-navigate, to create up celestial coordinates. To do this, they enlisted the help of the indigenous people here and built what we now today know to be some of the fine land artifacts, these great temple ruins and structures that scattered are all over the planet. These were created so that they'd be aligned with the horizon. For these priest-like beings, these entities from another space, time, or whatever, in order to calibrate the rising and setting of the constellations, the stars, and the luminaries. And that is why today we see, when we go to these places, that indeed the sunrise, the sunset, the rising of the moon, the rising of the primary planets are aligned with these stones. There's a reason. In fact, the word Nephilim, one of its derivations, which is used in the Bible, is the term watcher. They translate it connotatively as the term watcher, which I believe was attributed to them because they were in fact astronomers who watched the skies. In Lenormand and Chevalier, in their Ancient History of the East, Volume 2, they talk about the gigantic men, the Adites. These Adites are remembered by the Arabians as a great and civilized race. They were depicted as men of gigantic stature. Their strength was equal to their size, and they easily moved great blocks of stone. Many beings have visited this planet for various reasons, best known to themselves. The policy of most extraterrestrial visitors is total non-intervention, for either better or worse. The Nephilim did not obey this edict, and they knew that they were doing a forbidden thing. When asked for the rationale of why they may have interfered and not obeyed the edict of non-intervention, I think immediately of John Milton's Paradise Lost, the words of Satan himself, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. If you've been expurged from your own planetary system, and you're being pursued across the galaxy, and you arrive at this place and you are very sophisticated and scientifically and technologically advanced, and you have a population of the planet Earth that you can control and even modify, why not rule them? Now, originally the Serpent Masters did attempt normal sexual liaisons with the Earth women, but this proved unsuccessful. In Genesis 6 it says, "The sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them." So we're talking about the first phase was normal attempts at sexual liaisons with the Earth women. In the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast it says, "And the daughters of Cain, with whom the angels had accompanied, conceived. But they were unable to bring forth their children, and they died. And of the children who were in their wombs, some died, and some came forth. Having split open the bellies of their mothers, they came forth by their navels." So clearly this was absolutely not going to work. Then Samyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, "I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." In the ancient books, the book of Enoch, this is what we hear, the leader of the Nephilim, the leader of the fallen angels, as they ascend into the world and they make contact with the erstwhile indigenous population of the earth. They attempt to mate, they attempt to have normal sexual liaisons. That doesn't quite work. And then they go one step further. Now, the scholars are thinking that this sin that the leader is talking about actually concerns the physical impregnation of the earth females. And this is what is purported, this is what is put before us by people who've read these scriptures, that the sin involves the act of bonding sexually with these earth women. In fact, as I will show, that is not the case. Now, the book of Enoch, in the book of Enoch, the name of the leader of the Nephilim is thought to be recorded as Samyaza or Samael or Belial or Anzal. In Genesis 1 we read, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." It's a very famous and oft quoted passage from the Bible. But in fact, it says, if you go to the original Hebrew translation, it doesn't say, let us make man in our image. It says, and the God said, let us remake man in our image, after our likeness. And of course, there's that very controversial our. Well, I thought there was just one God. I thought the Israelites were monotheistic. So what's this our business? But more importantly, actually, for our purposes here, the term is actually to remake man, implying that man was already formed before the intervention. In 1 Corinthians, we see something of the same refrain. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last man, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, the second man from heaven. So this is like compounding the book of Genesis. This is an additional piece of information about Adam. There's two Adams. One is clearly spiritual and the other is terrestrial. We have God speaking to Adam and Eve in Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. This is Genesis 1. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Replenish the earth. Now, the secret of secrets is that to form man in our image refers not to normal mating procedure. It in fact involves a greater sin, and that sin was genetic hybridization. That was, of course, the splicing of the alien DNA with the human DNA, the cross-pollination, if you will, in ancient times. Now, the term that has been used in the Bible to speak of the creation, the Mark 1 creature that would be created as part alien DNA, part human DNA, is known loosely in the Bible as the firstborn. And one has to understand how the Bible works, how the language makes reference to these things. The firstborn. This is a reference to the sons of the serpent, because if we are wanting to call the original visitors the sons of the serpent or the people of the serpent, then it might be accurate to call their first progeny, their first creation, the sons of the serpent. This is a hybrid race, also known in the Bible as the Elohim. So when in the Bible you come across the word Elohim, whether it's in the Torah, whether it's in the Hebrew translations, or whether it's the Old Testament Bible English translations, when you're coming across the word Elohim, just remember that it doesn't mean what you're being told. The Elohim is the creation, the first creation of the visitors to this planet who created a sin, who crossed over their DNA with the DNA of the earth inhabitants, creating a most remarkable being that can be known henceforth as the son of the serpent. I prefer to refer to him in my book as Homo Atlantis because it was on Atlantis that he was created. Now Atlantis, as has been discovered and confirmed by individuals like Allen and Dallaire, Atlantis was a continent, not a continent. It was a citadel, a city-state upon a continent that was known by the name of Appalachia. Appalachia stretched for where Greenland, Iceland, and northern England is now, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a vast continent. And I believe that Atlantis was a city-state or a precinct, a temple complex on the continent of Appalachia. So again, we have to clear up the disinformation. When people refer to Atlantis as a continent, that's not correct. In the same way that London as a city is on the continent or the landmass of England. So Atlantis was on the landmass of the continent of Appalachia. And the experiments were done there on the continent of Appalachia, in the place we know as Atlantis. And there the hybridization program took place, and the creation we might want to call, for all intents and purposes, Homo Atlantis. Now the word created, as is used in the Bible, when translated, actually is much closer. The original word that was translated to be created actually is closer to the word for built. And the word Eden, in fact, may derive from Ea, Den, the precinct of Ea, because in the Sumerian mythologies, the head of Atlantis was called Ea, the god of the earth. And the word Titan comes from Tit and Den, meaning earthman, the great titans of old, the earthmen. Homo Atlantis was, of course, a remarkable individual, the likes of which one can only imagine. In fact, we are all descended from this remarkable being. Every human being that frequents the earth today is in some respect descended from Homo Atlantis, the original progeny of the visitors. Another term that might be used is only begotten. It was in Greek monogenes, and in Latin unigenetus. It was far from meaning only begotten. It meant that which was begotten of one parent, the father alone, not the offspring of the union of father and mother. So they're saying that it's a creature or a creation that is not of the sexes. It's from one parent alone. We have the prophet Enoch speaking of his own son Lamech. But look what words the book of Enoch chooses. I have begotten a strange son. He is not like an ordinary human being, but looks like the children of the angels of heaven to me. His form is different, and he is not like us. It does not seem to me that he is of me, but of the angels. Behold, I thought then within my heart that conception was due to the watchers and to the holy ones and the Nephilim, and my heart was troubled within me because of this child. Apuleius, the poet, the writer, he has a caption where he says, on some high crag, O king, set forth the maid. Hope for no bridegroom born of mortal seed, but fierce and wild and of the dragon breed. In the Epic of the Kings, from the poet Ferdowsi, we read that an Iranian king Sam is troubled over the strange appearance of his newborn son Zal. He says, no human being of this earth could give to such a monster birth. He must be of the demon race. Though human still in form and face, if not a demon, he at least appears a partly colored beast. Party-colored or partly colored means a different colored beast. I think that refers more to the fact that he's a hybrid. Now, this remarkable being, this Homo Atlantis, his job was to serve his masters. The continent of Appalachia, to which they went, they constructed the incredible citadel or city-state or precinct of Atlantis, and there they set to reign over the whole of the earth. And their servants, their slaves, their progeny, were to serve them in this. But there was a problem. Homo Atlantis, having both the alien DNA and the human DNA, had high intelligence. And a time came when he felt like he didn't want to be serving anymore. And during that period when they started to realize that they were being treated as servants and didn't want to continue serving, they decided it would be better to up and leave. And they did. And they left the precinct of Atlantis and migrated to another continent that we know today as the continent of Oceania or Lemuria. And this was what might be called the first great exodus of ancient times. Now, Lemuria was a continent that was speculated to be in the Pacific area or Pacific region of the world. But the word Lemuria means the land ancestral, the land of the ancestors. It comes from Mu or Muhadevi, the Hindu mother goddess. This goddess was the personification of Lemuria itself, the motherland of humanity. Shiva, her counterpart, is the great father of mankind. An Indian Tamil text, the Silapadarkan, or the Silapadarkaran, describes a lost continent in the Pacific and Indian Ocean that it calls Kamai Nadu, or Kamari Kandam, which means the dragon land of the immortal serpents. So the ancient tribes are talking about this land as the dragon land of the immortal serpents. There's that term again. The rebellion and exodus of the sons compelled the Atlanteans to return to their drawing boards. They began a second major hybridization program and created a Mark II being that we might want to call Adamic. These beings were of both sexes, but in the beginning they could not reproduce. They made excellent servants in the garden. So what we have is, after the exodus of the original sons of the serpent, the Homo Atlanteans, the original serpent masters, the visitors, the Nephilim, had returned to the drawing boards, and they created a second being to serve them, crossing DNA with the humans, the alien and the human DNA being crossed again. We have to look to the Mayan codexes here, and then the great book, the Popol Vuh, which is one of the surviving books that wasn't burned by the conquistadors. We find the most remarkable and monumental passage. Let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us. What shall we do to be invoked, to be remembered in earth? We have tried with our first creatures, but we could not make them venerate us. So then, let us try to make obedient, respectful beings who shall nourish and sustain us. In the Babylonian account, man is to be merely a slave, brought into being by Marduk at the plea of the defeated rebel gods, so that those gods themselves need not be subjected to servile labor. Man would be a puppet, a lowly, primitive creature. In the epic of Atrahasis, which dates to about 1630 BC, found in the Assyrian library of Nineveh, in a similar vein to the Enuma Elish, one of the main ideals is to show why man was created by the gods. It was so that they themselves need not work on the earth to produce their own food. So here we have it from the ancient text verbatim, that the gods wanted to be served. And if it didn't work with one of their groups, they were content to do it again and make another who would serve them obediently. In James Shreve's The Neanderthal Enigma, he says, an all-important transition did occur, but it happened so close to the present moment that we are still reeling from it. Somewhere in the vestibule of history, just before we started keeping records on ourselves, something happened that turned a passably precocious animal into a human being. So here we have the experts pondering and wondering about the whole mystery of the coming of Homo sapien. The Neanderthals, these are the entities or the beings that are always touted to be our ancestors, our direct ancestors. Neanderthals did not contribute mitochondrial DNA to human beings, we're now being told. Neanderthals are not our ancestors. So writes Christopher Knight and Robert Lomas in their book Uriel's Machine. And John A. Ball of Harvard, he says most evolutionists believe that that's life, was generated long ago, but perhaps it never was. Perhaps the earth was infected from elsewhere. Gunther Rosenberg, man is a unique animal, he says. He stands out like a sore thumb when comparisons are made with his cousins the apes. The differences are more numerous than the similarities. Darwin's theory of evolution is simply unproven. In Clifford Wilson's The Chariots Still Crash, he writes, Darwin himself admitted at times that mankind, in small ways, fitted his evolutionary theory the least of all creatures. Alfred Wallace, his contemporary formulator of the theory of evolution, was even more emphatic and forthrightly said that man was an exception to the orderly operation of biological laws, and that natural selection could not have operated in his case. What the true answer was, he hazarded no guess. Alan Alford, Homo sapiens has acquired a modern anatomy, language, capability, and a sophisticated brain, well beyond the needs of his everyday existence, apparently in defiance of the laws of Darwinism. There are a number of possible explanations for this anomaly. One is that mankind evolved in the sea, and that crucial fossil evidence is thus missing. Another is that Darwinian theory itself has a missing link. And a third explanation is that the genes for modern man were suddenly implanted by an intelligent extraterrestrial species who colonized the Earth. Now, again, two top scientists in California, Otto Binder and Max Flint, in their book, Mankind, Child of the Stars, have this to say. Molybdenum, a very rare metal, plays an important role as a trace element in the physiology of all Earth creatures. It is surprising, therefore, that life so dependent on a rare metal should arise on a molybdenum-poor world like ours. And Immanuel Velikovsky, the #1 most scandalized, marginalized, and lambasted scholar in the history of the world, has this to say. Most controversial is the evolutionary question. I have done a great deal of work on Darwin and can say with some assurance that Darwin did not derive his theory from nature, but rather superimposed a certain philosophical worldview on nature and then spent 20 years trying to gather the facts to make it stick. Alfred de Grazia of the Velikovsky Institute or Society, he says, what must be called the scientific establishment rose in arms not only against the new Velikovsky theories, but against the man himself. Efforts were made to block the dissemination of Dr. Velikovsky's ideas and to even punish supporters of his investigations. Universities, scientific societies, publishing houses, and popular press were approached and threatened. Social pressures and professional sanctions were invoked to control public opinion. There can be little doubt that in a totalitarian society, not only would Dr. Velikovsky's reputation have been at stake, but also his right to pursue his inquiry and perhaps even his personal affairs. And that's absolutely factual. And one of the major scientists that was put onto the case of Velikovsky to totally try to refute all of his theories was none other than Carl Sagan. That was Carl Sagan's evening job, if you will, was to go around and harass and try to refute all the theories of Immanuel Velikovsky, and he was not able to refute any of them. Alfred A. Wallace, no less the co-founder, who discovered natural selection previous to Darwin, and with him was the founder of the evolutionist theory. But on reviewing the startling differences between Homo sapiens and other mammals, he realized that man was an exception to the rules of evolution. He amazingly wrote, "Some intelligent power has guided or determined the development of man." The famous Greek historian Herodotus, he says, key aspects, or Tony Bushby commenting on Herodotus says, key aspects of Herodotus's writings involve descriptions of advanced beings living on earth, providing guidance and direction to local inhabitants. Now, according to Otto Binder and Max Flint, there are actually innumerable differences between man and the other primates. They delineate 312 physical differences, like the human female in heat without interruption. Man is the only truly hairless mammal. Only man cries copious tears. Man has delicate fingers and sensitive skin. The human skin has a slow healing rate, unlike other primates. Man lacks tooth gaps. Subcutaneous fat is found in humans only. Man has extraordinary facial mobility. Man has unique speaking apparatus. Man swallows slowly. Man has incredible eyes and seeing ability. And man makes sophisticated tools. And these are only a few of the extraordinary differences that can be found between the normal primates and the human creatures, the Homo sapien. They put it this way: Neanderthal man endured both cold and mild cycles with apparently equal success. He continued to exist in Western Europe right up to about 35,000 years ago, and then he abruptly disappeared. The evolutionary tendencies that he exhibited during this period are extremely puzzling, for he seems to have gotten more primitive, not less so. The early Cro-Magnons of 35,000 BC has a larger average brain case than we do today. Cro-Magnon is called our direct ancestor, meaning that by gradual and subtle transitions, he became the modern man. But there's no blending, no gradual shading. Now, of course, it's these Cro-Magnon individuals who are responsible, they say, for the famous cave paintings. Binder and Flint go on to say that this appearance of Neanderthal man and the advent of Cro-Magnon man at approximately the same time is one of the truly big stumbling blocks of the evolution theory, for they are non sequitur species. Neanderthal most decidedly could not be the direct ancestor of Cro-Magnon, for they were two distinctly different types of human, physically and even skeletally. Cro-Magnon man appeared with a mysteriously improved skeletal characteristics and with a cranial capacity that is amazingly in excess by 100 cubic centimeters of that of modern man. A similarly large degree of brain expansion occurred in absolutely no other species on Earth in all the ages of the past, nor